All right. So, oh, and also, here, one sec. Let's see. All right. So, welcome to the podcast. If you want to explain a little bit about yourself and you said you studied religious studies in college. Explain a little bit what you thought about studying that, and yeah.
Yeah, so my name's Gabe Glasser. I'm 26 years old. I uh, I'm I don't want to talk too much about how I know you. I'll just say I guess I know Ethan from this program we're doing together, Praxis. But before I did that program, which is kind of like an alternative education program, I did uh, go to college and I studied religious studies. And basically, religious studies is um, it's different from theology, and that theology is studying a religion predicated on the belief that that religion is true. Um, and religious studies comes from an academic perspective, so it's really a lot of history and studying scriptures from an academic viewpoint.
So trying to get kind of a bigger picture understanding of all the different religions and how they all fit together, if you will.
Yeah, and also looking at religion as something that looking at how it affects the society, and like looking at all the forces that led to the creation of that particular religion in the context of its time and place. It's a really interesting field, something I really enjoyed studying.
Yeah, definitely. I was looking to studying that myself. So you said you enjoyed it. What kind of got you interested in it, in studying that in the first place? Say, like before you went into college, like what were your inspirations to study religious studies?
hmm So I was raised in a pretty religious household. I was raised in a religion called Christian Science, which it's probably one of the lesser known denominations of Christianity. And it was found, I'll say a little bit about that. So Christian Science was founded in sometime in the 1800s by this woman in New England named Mary Baker Eddy. And uh, it basically takes it looks at the teachings of Jesus Christ, and a lot of Christian Science is based on the belief that the that we have the ability to heal like Jesus did. So, yeah, if people want to learn more about that, they can read about that. I won't go off too much into a tangent on that. But basically, I was raised in a pretty spiritually minded household. And I remember when I was little in Sunday school in church, um, I would always have this thought when I was reading the Bible that, like, how how many hands did this pass through, this version of this text? Like, how accurate can this story really be? Because I thought, how so many people are taking the words of this text, the Bible, to be absolute fact, and making really important decisions based on what's said in there and how
Yeah,
they treat other people. And I thought, how easy it could have been for some some selfish or controlling king of some sorts to change some words and change the course of history and the way people practice Christianity. And I just always had that thought when I was a kid. And so when it came time to choose a major in college, I didn't really have much direction that time in my life, and so I didn't know what I wanted to do as a career. So religious studies was something that when I found out that that was like an option, I decided like, yeah, that sounds like something would be really interesting to me. And I had absolutely no plans to leverage that degree into a form of a career at all. I just knew I wanted to study it.
Yeah. So you went at that from that viewpoint. Did you have any knowledge of any like deeper knowledge of all the other religions, or you kind of just like I just kind of just want to learn and get a more well-rounded viewpoint of not just Christianity but all of them, I guess, because that's kind of what that major is, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I think at that point, um, I had kind of started to do some reading on my own, and I had been getting into reading texts on yoga and I think mostly I was reading about Indian stuff at that time, like yoga. I think I had read the Yoga Sutras by Patanjali and the Bhagavad Gita, and those had really um, they really sparked something in me that I was like, wow, this is something I want to learn more about.
Yeah, definitely. uh so you said, yeah, all those Indian traditions and those sparked some interest in you. And
I want to mention one other thing that was a major, now that I think back on it, a
all
major
right.
reason I wanted to study religious studies is I wanted to learn about Islam in particular, specifically because, growing up, um, with 9/11 and this whole problem with Islamic terrorism, I wanted to learn about what is behind that ideology, that extremist um, Islamist ideology.
Yeah.
So that was another factor. I really wanted to take classes and learn about Islam and in general, like how can a religion which steers some people to like, help their neighbor and live an ethical life can also steer others towards just slaughtering innocent people. I wanted to learn about how that can happen.
And would you say now, after you have finished your major and studied that in college, you now understand that or have a different perspective on Islam? Are you like, were there like assumptions or perceptions on Islam that you had before that you realized were uh maybe not going to say just untrue, but like how did studying that change your perception of Islam?
Well, I'd say before I studied anything about Islam, I can't remember what my attitudes really were about it. I know I didn't have like a prejudice perspective because I knew that the majority of Muslims in the world are not terrorists,
Yeah.
and so I knew it was a complex issue, and I feel like I got a pretty good understanding of the nuances within that tradition, and it is a very complex um, it's a complex issue, but it's also I'd say from studying the tradition, the history, and the texts of Islam, it's definitely not difficult to see how someone who interacts with that tradition and those texts could be guided um, to become a terrorist.
Yeah.
It's not very far fetched to to see how that could happen.
Yeah, like when it gets interpreted in certain ways.
Yeah.
And because we would you say because we don't know exactly what the or this is probably true of almost any religion. It's like we don't know exactly what the original writers of these scriptures were trying to tell us, and a big part of probably what you studied is understanding how do we interpret these documents, and like there's you probably learned a lot about how they get misinterpreted in many ways, or how maybe we don't know how to interpret it because we don't it was so long it was all these were written so long ago,
Hmm.
right?
And context is so important when reading a scripture, because, for example, the context. Um, so I'll give a little background on the Quran. So the Quran is different from what we would say the Bible or other texts, where, uh, for example, in the Bible, it's a compilation basically of the writings of many different authors in a general time window and in a general region of the world, that all have to say something about this particular Abrahamic tradition. So we call Judaism, Christianity, and Islam the three Abrahamic faiths,
Yeah.
because uh, they all have to do with the same line of uh, prophets and figures, which are Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Isaac. All those figures are prominent in all three of those religions, and so basically, the Quran is this guy Muhammad. I won't go into too much detail of the story, but he starts getting these visitations from this angel Gabriel, and or Jibril in Arabic. So he gets these visitations routinely, and the angel tells him to write down what he's communicating to him. And so that's what the Quran is. The Quran is uh, the words of Gabriel as transcribed through the Prophet Muhammad. So it's important to understand that the within the Islamic world, the Quran itself is thought to be the word of God itself. Muhammad didn't write it. It's verbatim what God told Gabriel to tell Muhammad. So
He
so
just
that's important.
yeah.
So that's important to understand that, because even today in the Islamic world, like if you deface a Quran in any way, it's very serious. And in some parts of the world, you'll probably be killed by a mob in your community, because it's not just a book. It's like literally something that's God's word itself.
Yeah.
How they think of it. Um, Sorry, I almost forgot where I was going with this because I started to get into too much detail. Uh, could you remind me what your
I,
question was?
if I remember correctly, it was something about how different religions a big part of understanding religion
Okay.
is understanding how we interpret
So
and yeah.
yeah. So I remembered. Yeah, I was talking about the context of in which these things were written,
Yeah.
and how that is important understanding how we interpret them today. So a lot of these, each the Quran is divided into what's called surahs, and each surah is one revelation from the angel Gabriel to Muhammad. So so these revelations were coming to him regularly throughout a period of, I think, about 3 years. So throughout that time, starting with the first revelations, he doesn't know anything in it. He's being told, start this new religion. This is how you organize it. These are the tenets. So bit by bit, he's getting instructions on how to form this community of what they called the ummah, the community of believers of this new faith. And so you can kind of, in a way, you can kind of, in many instances, understand and get a glimpse of the forming of the religion itself through the Quran, because it's happening and there's certain revelations about, oh yeah, how to deal with this group, because they're now, uh, as the story is progressing, becoming a prominent uh, political, and like they're a new group in society,
Yeah.
and they eventually become a military group. And uh, Muhammad is, it's important to understand that he's not just a religious leader, but he's also a general and a military leader. And the group he creates, this of this new religion, will go on to uh, create basically the fastest spreading military empire in history. In a matter of um, maybe 100 years, they've conquered um, all the way up to Southeast Asia, into Northern Africa. Just incredible the way, the speed at which the in which Islam spread. So it's important to understand that history, that a lot of these uh, a lot of the military language and the violent language that's in the Quran is because that's that's literally what was going on at that time. Muhammad was leading a military conquest.
Yeah. I I see. I didn't know that. That's
Yeah,
insightful into, and I guess because he was leading a military conquest, and then on top of that, they don't see the Quran as just how to live their life. They see it as directly from God. That kind of changes probably how their behavior and how they view uh, living what the Quran tells them to do, I guess. And because it's the word of God, that can lead some people to radical behavior to protect their religion.
yeah, yeah. It's
In
the same. It's kind of the same with like these Westboro Baptist Christians. Are you familiar with them?
I'm not.
So this is this group, the Westboro Baptist Church, that they do really nasty, despicable things. Like they'll go to funeral, they'll picket funerals of uh, of homosexual people, and say, like, they have these signs saying like God hates gays, and they're really against homosexuality and stuff like that, because that's what we'd call fundamentalists. So they read the scripture and they just take it at its most literal meaning,
Yeah.
and most of the time picking out the things that are most like uh problematic, and for some reason like choosing to focus on those instead of like all the positive things that are being taught. So that's what we have in the Islamic world with it's the school of Islam called Wahhabism, the Wahhabis. And that's all of Saudi Arabia, uh and like the Taliban, Al Qaeda. These are fundamentalist groups that they take the Quran. um there's no wiggle room for interpretation or understanding of context, or what it meant then versus what it should mean to us now. They want to live in every way as Muhammad did in that time, and that's why people in Saudi Arabia dress. Uh, they still dress like people dress in Muhammad's time, and they don't want to. They want to outlaw music and a lot of forms of technology, um, like even ringtones on phones and stuff. So
Yeah.
that's the very fundamentalist branch of Islam.
And yeah, on the basis of the idea of fundamentalism, I I feel like, don't you think a lot of the media or certain perceptions of Islam are based on the idea of Islamic fundamentalism? When, like, I don't know if you have any idea of like the percentage or anything, but for however many fundamentalist Islamists, there's quite a bit of people that study the religion that aren't fundamentalists and that just are using it to practice it in their life, and they're not taking it and believing it on like every word. And like you said,
Yeah,
all the stuff where they implement what in Muhammad's time they're trying to implement it today. Those are the fundamentalists, and then all the others are just, I guess, not as strict on everything.
yeah, for sure. And yeah, I won't. I I'll recommend a book. There's a really good book called Refuting ISIS, and I wish I could remember the author, but it's by this imam, this Muslim scholar who's really well versed in his tradition, and he basically is writing this book to other Muslims, especially young Muslims, and
Yeah,
explaining to them how, because ISIS, the is so-called Islamic State organization, they claim to be uh, they claim to be creating the caliphate. So there's this idea in Islam that um, the Muslim religion isn't completely fulfilled until there is a Muslim government in place, or that's called a caliphate. So in Islam, it's unique among religions because it's not just a religion, it also puts forth a complex legal system, and the ideal world called for in Islam is one where there's zero separation of church and state. That um, there's a whole area in Islam called fiqh, which means jurisprudence. It's Muslim law, Sharia law, and it's very detailed, and um, that's a long tradition of scholars studying law. It's a very rigorous process of 10 or 12 years to be a Muslim scholar and an expert in fiqh or Muslim law. So, uh, sorry, I keep losing my train of thought. But
so it's so intertwined with the culture that it kind of changes the, like, how it's practiced compared to other religions, other Abrahamic religions especially. And
yeah, so I apologize. I was talking about that book, Refuting ISIS. So
uh,
he
oh yeah, and the author, I just looked it up, Muhammad al Yaqubi,
yeah,
Yaquob. Yeah,
Jacobi, yeah,
yeah,
that's him, Jacobi. So basically, ISIS claims to be the fulfillment of this caliphate, and this guy is writing this book as a call to the Muslim world to say, um, no, absolutely, these guys are not a legitimate caliphate. In fact, they're not even real Muslims. Um, and he backs it up with all sorts of. It's really written for other Muslims that understand the religion. So it might take a little googling every page or here to understand what he's
yeah.
talking about, because it's within the context of that you understand Islam. But it's a really interesting book, and he basically lays out um, in a through his really rich understanding of the tradition of how it's not a legitimate caliphate.
Exactly. And that's, so you said that's basically like that's Muslims trying to tell other Muslims that um like there is no one way to practice, and it's like we don't need to install this government just to be considered a Muslim. And yeah, I mean, you kind of hammered
Well,
that
exactly,
point
because
already.
there's it's a I think it's a pretty big issue. You know, when I was in college, some of my professors within the academic study of Islam world, there were some people saying that we think they thought we're about, excuse me, thought we're about to witness in the next 100 years possibly a Muslim reform movement. You know, much like happened with the Christian church with around the time of Martin Luther
Yeah.
and the creating of Protestantism. So we'll see.
Yeah, that would definitely. So let's see. On to
So yeah,
so
we kind of just jumped into that
jumped into
pretty
Islam
fast.
right there, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, let's see what here. So as you studied religious studies, what were some of your favorite scriptures, and did you notice any, I would say, like similarities or connections between a lot of the religions? A guy named Aldous Huxley proposes a perennial philosophy. Not saying that's, I mean, that's an interesting idea to ponder, but did you notice yourself any similarities? I mean, a lot of the Eastern religions, it's pretty obvious that a lot of them are going towards the same thing. Buddhism, they're trying to, I can't remember the exact word for it, basically enlightenment. In Hinduism, there's like moksha. In Taoism, it's being one with the Tao or whatever. Did you notice those similarities between East and West, and what were some of your favorite scriptures that you read?
Between East and West. So you mentioned all those similarities between the Eastern religions.
Yeah,
I would say something you didn't specifically ask about, but I'll include is that between the Western religions, so between the three Abrahamic faiths,
yeah,
Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there's definitely similarities there. Um, in that a theme within all those religions is the academic term for it is eschatology, which is the idea that the world is going to end. That's the academic word for the study of how people think about the apocalypse. And that's a major theme within those three Abrahamic religions is they're all centered around this belief that the world's going to end, you know, judgment day. And
yeah,
you can find other major similarities too, like the monotheism. But I would say definitely when you're looking at the comparison of those what we'd call Western religions with the Eastern ones, the similarities are there for sure. But I'd say that uh, they're more so in those Western religions esoteric traditions.
yeah,
Um, so all Islam, Christianity, and Judaism all have a so-called mystical component to them, a tradition that is considered esoteric. So when you look at what those people believe, it's it sounds a lot like the Eastern religions for sure.
yeah. But so I guess the similarities are all there, but it's harder to find them in the Western traditions, and I guess there's a reason why we call them the Eastern and the Western, because, like you said, There's the Judgment Day similarities between the West, and then the East. There's the transcendence of self kind of similarity in all
Mm,
the what they're trying to reach, their
yeah.
final goal. And
But my point is like that idea of transcendence of self.
yeah,
I mean, so I don't know if you want to, if this is something you want to go into a little more, but I think it's really interesting is the esoteric traditions in the Abrahamic faiths are all about transcendence of self.
yeah,
So in Islam you have Sufism, and in Judaism you have Kabbalah, and then in Christianity, which I'd say is probably the most the hardest to trace and the hardest to find still in existence today is the Gnostic tradition, the Christian Gnosticism.
yeah, we could. I would definitely be interested in going into those because I've heard about them briefly, but like I know I've just got a book, the Kybalion or something, which
Oh yeah,
I believe I'm intending to read that in the next few weeks about. Um, you said I'm pretty sure that's Judaism or something, but
yeah. I've heard of that book. I've never read it though. But it
yeah,
does it have to do with Kabbalah, which is
yeah,
Judaism?
in like
Okay.
the mystical traditions of Judaism.
Yeah.
Well, then you said there's like because I've never heard of the one you said about Christianity. I've heard a little bit about the Judaism, and tell me, is this is more of a central idea in Islam? But I remember taking a religions course in high school, and they briefly mentioned that in Islam there's the idea of jihad, and then the original. What I was taught was that the original tent, the lesser jihad, is kind of what you see all these fundamentalists practicing, and they're using force to try to perpetuate the religion. And I was taught that the greater jihad is like the is considered the journey inward, and that's why they pray like 5 times a day, because they're practicing the greater jihad of understanding themselves, which could be similar to some of the mystical traditions of
Hmm.
the Kabbalah and the other, yeah, in the Western traditions.
Yeah, I heard that exact same thing in one of my classes too. So that idea of the real meaning of jihad, meaning because jihad means like to jihad means struggle, literally. It means to struggle for something in in the service of a cause, a great cause. And so that's exactly right. In Sufism, uh, that's where they. I think I think Sufism is really where that idea comes from. That the real meaning of jihad is the struggle against what we might call your lower self, or like
Yeah,
your negative tendencies as an individual, that you need to struggle against all of those carnal passions or whatever in order to become more pure and closer to Allah.
yeah, definitely. So, do you want to explain a little bit more about the Christian mystical faith? I mean, I you said Gnosticism or something, and
Yeah.
I've heard I've heard some references to like Saint Francis of Assisi, or I can't remember the
Assisi,
exact.
yeah.
Yes, yeah, that's what it is. And I feel that's like the only mystical references to Christianity. I'm not sure if Saint Francis practiced what the mystical tradition, but do you want to explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Saint Francis was a Catholic saint. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, he was Catholic. Um, so they would very much not. They would the Catholic Church considers Gnosticism to be heresy. But you can find many instances of Catholic saints having mystical experiences, or at least writing about that. So that doesn't mean that um, Catholicism necessarily rejects any mystical experiences or anything, because they embrace this huge litany of saints and kind of celebrate them, like, oh, he could do that, he had all these mystical experiences and stuff. So but the history of Gnosticism is really, I actually didn't study it too in depth, but what I do know about it is, so basically, when Jesus started forming the religion, uh, the idea is that, so he had his 12 disciples, you know?
Yeah.
So the belief, from what I've heard, is with Gnosticism is that he is that they believe that, you know, Jesus gave teachings to the masses, and then he also gave other teachings directly to his 12 disciples. And and that's what Gnosticism is. It's like the secret teachings of Jesus. And from that, there were kind of, now these were, it's interesting because these, what we'd call Gnostic schools or
Yeah.
Gnostic groups, they were we know we know from some of their writings, I believe. I'm not sure if there's Gnostic writings that survive from that era of being, you know, shortly after or in the time of Jesus, but there's definitely writings from other people, from historians of that time, talking about these Christian groups. And it was towards the middle of the 4th century when the during the council of, what's called the Council of Nicaea, when all these bishops, these Christian bishops, leaders got together, and they decided to all agree, because these different groups had kind of differences in belief and interpretation,
Yeah.
and they decided to have this council and get together and say, to write it all down and say, no, this is what we believe on this point. Like, they argued for a long time about what the Trinity means. Like, is Jesus separate from God, or are they the same? How does the Trinity relate? Or is it three different things, or is it one thing appearing in three different ways, etc.? So that was when they really got down to it and kind of defined what their religion was going to believe. And that was that's basically what defined the Catholic Church, was that.
And then
and
after that,
and the Gnostics began to be persecuted after that, and they had to go
yeah,
into hiding.
and therefore making it more esoteric to this day
Exactly,
because
yeah.
that happened. Yeah.
Yeah. But one group that is somewhat well known and you can find information on was called the Hesychasts.
All right.
And if you want to,
How do you
if you want
spell
me to
that?
spell that, it's
Yeah.
HESYCHASTS, I believe.
All right.
um So this, I think that's one group you can read on. Another one is the Valentinians, the Valentinian Gnostics, and that sounds like so they're, the guy who founded that, I think, was called Valentine.
Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting. I had this professor. I went to University of Oregon, and she had, the year I took her class, she had just transferred to the University of Oregon from Princeton. And the reason she chose a job at University of Oregon is apparently, so University of Oregon's in the town of Eugene, and apparently in Eugene was one of the last surviving Valentinian Gnostic groups, and that was her specialty, was in Gnosticism. So she transferred to U of O in order to study this group. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is. So, yeah, I mean, there's obviously not very many Gnostic like living practices today. If that's the only Valentinian one, and I can't imagine there are too many of the not sure how to the Hesychast or whatever you
Hesychast,
mentioned,
yeah.
Hesychast.
So yeah,
Yeah,
one of so if there's actually something really interesting. I believe it was in the 1920s. There was this large clay pots discovered in somewhere in Egypt, and they found all these texts, these scrolls in them, and that's what's referred to today as the Library of Nag Hammadi. So these texts in here were gospels, were writings about Jesus Christ that had previously never that aren't in the Bible. They're what we call non-canonical gospels. So
yeah,
in the Council of Nicaea, the church decided this is the canon, which is the group of texts that are going to be included in our Bible. Like, we're going to use this version, we're going to keep out these. So these are non-canonical stories about Jesus, and you can read them online today. There's the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, among others, but I think those are the two most well-known and interesting ones because they have really interesting ideas in them. And in those two gospels, you can definitely see, like you were saying, some kind of Eastern ideas in there.
so
And specifically those Valentinians, I know that one of their main beliefs is, so are you familiar with Mary Magdalene?
I'm not.
So Mary Magdalene is a figure in the Bible, in the story of Jesus, where she was thought to be a prostitute, and there's this episode in the gospel where it says that there's this woman Mary, and she was she was unclean. I think it says she was possessed with uh, seven evil spirits or something. But but the way it's interpreted is that she was probably a prostitute, and Jesus basically, um, I think the story is he washed her feet. He basically paid attention to this woman and like blessed her and said, um, I think the story goes like everyone's going like, "Oh, Jesus, she's so unclean. Why are you paying attention to this woman?" And he says like, "Let the first one of you that's without sin cast the first stone," or something. Like, basically the idea is like, we're all uh, none of you are perfect, so shut your mouths. But basically, in the Valentinian tradition, they believe that uh, Jesus took on this woman, Mary Magdalene, as one of his close disciples, and she became the 13th disciple, and that they actually got married and had children, and that there's a bloodline that actually descends from Jesus and Mary even till today. And then that even goes into a bunch of crazy stuff like secret societies in Europe, um, that believe that they know who that bloodline is, and it's kept in secret through like royal families and stuff. There's a lot of crazy stuff on the internet you can find about that, but that's one of the major beliefs of the Valentinians, is that they worship God as like masculine and feminine. It's like this yin yang idea that's represented in this supposed union between Jesus and Mary. and
That's how
and
they
it
see
actually,
God.
huh?
That's how they see God, you said?
Yeah, yeah. So they see God in kind of like a Taoist or Hindu perspective of like this union of masculine and feminine energies, like a yin yang. And actually, in the Gospel of Thomas, it has a lot of language like this. Like Jesus says, you have to. Sorry, excuse me. He says you have to make the masculine and the feminine join, and you have to make the outer and the inner come into harmony. And it has all this kind of mystical language that actually reads a lot like the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah,
It's pretty interesting.
definitely. I'll have to check some of those out. But overall, it seems like um, it's hard to escape the fact that the majority of people perceive Christianity differently. And so like I'll start having conversations with people about, yeah, but there are mystical ideas in Christianity and Islam. And then like the response I always get back is, yeah, but what are the majority of people doing in these religions? And that's kind of like why they're esoteric. Would you say that a lot of these esoteric ideas are more like the central ideas in some of these Eastern religions? And you said you read the Upanishads or the Bhagavad Gita. And so what it seems to me is that some of these ideas in Eastern religions, like some of the main ideas in the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads or um, in Taoism, they can be found in every religion, although they're more esoteric teachings in some of these religions. Uh, what did what do you think some of the main ideas in some of these Eastern scriptures are, and how do you say they relate to Christian mysticism? Or yeah, I'm not sure. Let me try to formulate that better. Um, not to. I mean, the point isn't to say which religion is right or wrong. It's just so some of these esoteric religions in the West are provide more central ideas, such as they talk about these mystical experiences that some of the people practicing those religions had, and a lot of those mystical experiences are conveyed in a lot more detail in some of these Eastern religions, right?
Yeah.
Uh, what would you say were some of your insights and what you took from some of these Eastern scriptures, such as the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads, for example?
Yeah, well, first I'd say I think that's a really interesting distinction you made, that in the Eastern religions, these ideas that from a Western perspective we might think of as esoteric
Yeah,
really form the exoteric, the whole thing in the Eastern religion, it can be thought of as, from a Western perspective, as an esoteric teaching. That's a really interesting distinction I think you made, because it's true that in the Western religions, most of, or a lot of what makes up Western religious doctrine is more like socio-cultural instructions on how to live. It's
yeah,
like, don't do this, do this, don't kill people. It's like a lot of rules on um, how to form society and live better, at least from their perspective. So like for example, in Islam, like Muhammad came along and said, to be a Muslim you have to follow these things, and one of them a lot of them historians will look at and say, actually, these can be seen from one perspective as just like really practical instructions. For example, he said you have to pray 5 times daily, and every time before you pray, you have to wash your hands and your feet. And in that part of the world at that time, that was not something people did very regularly. So he introduced like hygienic practices into his culture, which is interesting. So I think in Western in Western religions, there's a lot of things about rules in interacting with other people, and you don't find as much of that in the Eastern religions. They're more concerned with the individual and their inner experience and how they can undergo an inner transformation.
Can I add something?
Something about the inner nature of the human being. It doesn't. They're not really so concerned with the culture.
Yeah. So yeah, like you said, the Western religions are focused on rules, and I might add that like it seems a lot of those rules, the reason they're so powerful is because that it's more of there's terms for this, like in Western it's dualism, and Eastern it's more non-dual. And I
Hmm.
think what that means on a practical level is in these Western religions we have this dualistic setup where you follow these rules and then you get to some place that's other than where you are now in
Mm,
the afterlife, and they're kind of
yeah,
this, you need to do something now in order to get somewhere else, whereas in the Eastern religions it seems more like uh we're
like
not so.
now is like transform your experience now. It's not about a reward later.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
about right now. And it's like when people ask, "Oh, what do the?" I've heard this many times. Like, there's a lot of struggle for. It seems to me that there's a lot of struggle in the Western culture to understand these Eastern religions because we're trying to interpret it from a Western perspective of, well, do they believe in a God? Do they believe in the
Hmm.
afterlife? It's like that's a little bit more
Yeah.
complicated than that. It's more
Yeah.
they're not so much so focused on an afterlife. They're more focused on what can I do to change my experience and live more deeply right here and right now.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That the way we look at Eastern religions is oftentimes like through the screen of our very ingrained understanding of our own Western traditions. And yeah, it really can explain some of the problems we run into as Westerners
Yeah,
interacting with those things.
definitely. So on the topic of Eastern traditions, the difference, I guess, a big part of Eastern religions that I found, one of the central concepts behind them is uh, we have to practice and we have to put in the work in order to transform our experience and have these insights. Uh, Personally, when reading, I've read a couple scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, and but like not much. But when I read about any of these ideas in Eastern philosophy, such as non-duality or just like what in Hinduism it's moksha, Buddhist enlightenment, what I see as a central theme among every single text I've ever read is you can't understand what you're trying to learn through the mind, through the intellect. You have to put in the work, you have to meditate, you have to
Hmm.
experience it for yourself. And if you don't experience it, then you'll never truly understand it. So, what onto the
Yeah,
topic of meditation, what's your experiences with that and meditation practices or yeah.
yeah, I think that's an interesting point. That it's true. A lot of the Eastern traditions talk about, the intellect as not being like the ultimate, uh, the ultimate part of ourselves. And I think that's why in the West we struggle with those things, is because in the West we do consider the intellect to be like the end all and be all of the human being. Uh, and a lot of those Eastern traditions talk about, no, in order to actually reach the goal of Buddhism or Hinduism or Taoism, you have to transcend the intellect. And that's that idea of non-duality, is that the intellect uh, can only deal in dualities. It only knows left and right, hot and cold. That's the only way it can understand and interpret our experience. But I think that's why those traditions are so challenging. Is yeah, they challenge us to contemplate if there's an experience that's actually beyond the intellectual framing of our experience.
Yeah, exactly. It's very difficult to understand some of these religions, and
But you
yeah,
were asking about
meditation.
my experience
Yeah, what is your experience with that?
with with learning
L-
about Eastern religion, or with meditation.
Let's move it towards meditation, cuz
Okay.
like what's your I guess you can kind of combine both of them. Like what's your
Yeah.
experience using meditation to understand these Eastern concepts? And like what meditation techniques have you practiced?
Yeah. Well, I started learning about all this. I think the first I'm trying to remember. I think the one of the first things I read about meditation was the Yoga Sutras by Patanjali. Um, and so the Yoga Sutras uh, come from, I guess you would say, Hinduism. Hinduism is an interesting term because it's a Western created term. No one in India calls themselves like, I'm a Hindu. Well, they might now, because that term is kind of widely used on the world stage. But
Yeah.
that was uh, that was a term created by Western people to describe the huge conglomeration of insanely different and diverse religious practices that they saw people practicing in India. And it's really hard to say that's one religion, because within so-called Hinduism, there's so many different traditions.
Yeah. That's why a lot of West, like when you look at it from a Western perspective, people are like, yeah, there's like 10,000 gods or something.
Exactly, yeah.
It's like Hinduism isn't just one religion.
Not
It's
at all.
yeah.
Yeah, and there's really no other, in that sense, there's really no other religion you can compare that to, if you even want to call Hinduism religion. I don't even think that's a uh I think all Hinduism means is like religious type things that come from the country of India. It's like,
Yeah.
beyond that, there's not a lot in common you can find between some of these traditions and practices from there. But yeah, so one of the major traditions that comes from India is the tradition of yoga. And Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is considered one of the most seminal works in the tradition of yoga.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I started practicing yoga, especially when I went to college. I took yoga classes, and I was really interested not just in the physical part, but in the whole philosophy of yoga, which is an incredibly nuanced and rich tradition that has all this understanding about how the body interacts with the mind. And the purpose of yoga postures is to affect a change in our bodies so that we're able to meditate better. That's the purpose of what we would call yoga in the West today. You know, the physical
Yeah.
stretching and twisting thing.
Because
Um,
yeah, I was really intrigued the first time I heard about, learned, like actually delved a little bit deeper into these Eastern yogic practices. Is
yeah,
that most of what people in what we'd call Hindu culture, when they refer to yoga, it's not what we think of as yoga. They're
no,
practicing like yoga of the mind, which is what we would call meditation, or
yeah,
yoga of compassion, or like
yeah.
bhakti.
So the
Yeah,
exactly, yeah. So the word yoga in Sanskrit actually just means union, or it means it's actually the relation of Sanskrit to English is actually interesting. Um, there's I'm not really I don't know very much about linguistics at all in the history of that, but I know that there's definitely some evidence that there's certain English words that share Sanskrit roots. So the word yoke, like, you know, Yoke,
yeah,
like you put on a cow or whatever, like a thing around its neck. I'm pretty sure that comes from the Sanskrit word yog for like yoga. So it means to like join two things and for them to become one thing. That's what yoga means. And and so the real meaning of yoga is for the individual to join with the divine, whatever you want to call that, that greater intelligence, that portion of the that deepest part of the human being that is universal and is like the life force or intelligence of the whole universe, is what Western tradition would call God. So you could say, from kind of a Western centric perspective, that yoga really means becoming one with God, or that divinity, whatever you want to call it, and the practices. But all the practices that go help you do that are called different forms of yoga.
exactly. And it seems why it seems that that's why yoga is like the main Hindu practice. All the different sects practice different forms of yoga, but
Yeah,
it's all yoga because it's aimed towards the same end goal of the religion of moksha, or nirvana. I don't know if that's a Buddhist term, but there,
yeah. Nirvana is a. I believe nirvana was a is a Buddhist term exclusively, but yeah, moksha, which means liberation.
yeah, is the end goal of yoga, and no matter what type of yoga, which is why when you're studying, tell me more about the types of yoga you practice in the uh, what was it, the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra.
Yeah. So yeah, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is he created a system. Uh, well, I'm not sure if he invented it, but the system that he expounds on in the Yoga Sutras is known as Ashtanga Yoga, which means Ashtanga means 8 limbs, like a limb like of a tree, or an arm or a leg.
Yeah,
So it's a form of yoga that has 8 different steps, and I actually can't remember off the top of my head, but um, these are things like asana, which means the body posture,
yeah.
like, you know, the different yoga poses. Those
Hmm.
are called asanas. Pranayama, which are different exercises to control the breath.
Yeah, breathing.
Pranayama exercises. Um, Dharana, which I believe is concentration, and dhyana, which is meditation. So it's kind of like these it's these stages of practice that you get your asanas down, and then you move into pranayama. And then, oh yeah, two of them along there are yamas and niyamas, which yamas are like things you should do, like they're like codes of conduct, and niyamas are things you shouldn't do. They're like, so yamas and niyamas are like rules of living, codes of conduct. So this 8-limbed path culminates with the eighth limb, which is samadhi, which is samadhi, actually the roots of that word. So sama is the root from which, this is Sanskrit, by the way, Sanskrit word. So samadhi is composed of two different roots. So sama is actually what we get today, is the root of our word same. So it comes from that Sanskrit root.
Yeah.
So sama means like uniform. And then dhi means the mind. So you could say samadhi means like uniform mind, or a state of mind where, a non-dual state of mind,
Yeah.
where there's no difference between the subjective and objective, the perceiver and the perceived. And um, he goes into this a lot in the Yoga Sutras, but that's the goal of yoga, is this experience of samadhi, or yoga, or union of the individual with, you could say, the universal consciousness.
Yeah. And again, the primary goal of a lot of these Hindu subsects is samadhi, or can be called anything that based on the like we said, Hinduism. It's not
Mm-hmm.
just one religion. And yeah, so I was looking up the 8 limbs, and yeah, you basically got them all. The other one was pratyahara, withdrawal of
Yeah,
the senses,
yeah, yeah,
and but yeah, the main, I guess, because I was always interested in what the the Western form of yoga, how that derives from the Eastern form, and like where that fits into Eastern yogic practice. And I guess you kind of, I think it's a really interesting idea that the asana, the primary goal of the asana is to go deeper into meditation, to get us closer
yeah,
to samadhi, to, instead of just, in the West, a lot of times it's just exercise and
yeah.
staying in shape.
Which,
So
in within the Indian tradition, they definitely do consider excuse me, they definitely do consider the physical benefits of the asanas.
yeah,
And within Ayurveda is it's arguably the oldest healing and system of medicine in the world, which comes from India. So Ayurveda like prescribes certain asanas to treat certain illnesses. So there definitely is that understanding, but the main purpose is, um, it's basically to make it so the body is not an obstacle to meditating for long periods of time.
yeah, like
It's to make it so when you sit, you have proper posture, and you're there's no tightness or anything in your body, because you've kind of loosened everything up.
exactly. So do you have any experience with yana yoga?
Yana?
Yeah, so like self inquiry, that's kind of, I'm pretty
Oh,
sure, the yoga of wisdom, I think it's
like
called.
Jnana. Yeah.
Jnana. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't know if that's how
Uh,
you say it.
I think it's pronounced Jnana. Like
Yeah,
that Jn is kind of like a uh, it's almost like an ing sound. It's like Jnana. I think that's how you
yeah,
say it.
yana. Yeah. I mean, it's a different
Or
language.
would we would spell it like Nyana.
Inyana, Yana,
Nyana, yeah, like Nya.
Niana. Yeah,
Nya, nya.
yeah,
Kind of like that, yeah.
yeah,
But yeah, that's one I'm definitely familiar with that. So I've read some of the teachings of like Ramana Maharshi. Um, but yeah, I haven't read a whole lot about that particular school.
yeah,
But I understand its idea. So basically, you're using the intellect to arrive at the truth about yourself, which is that you are not that your being is not actually confined to like your ego, to your body, that you're actually something much vaster than what we experience in our day-to-day lives.
yeah. I mean, to me, it seems almost paradoxical and like weird to think of Yana yoga because, like you said, it's using the intellect with the goal of not using, with the goal of transcending the intellect.
Yeah, it's like an analogy I've used is say you have a thorn in your foot. In order to get the thorn out, you can use another thorn. And then once you get out the thorn, you throw both thorns away. So it's like using the intellect in order to override the intellect.
Yeah,
Cover what's beyond that.
with the base question of using who am I?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's the Ramana Maharshi teaching, yeah.
Yeah,
And I've practiced that at some points in my life, and I think that's a really powerful practice if you can really like kind of grasp hold of that practice, because I think the power with that practice lies in it's not just literally like saying those words in your head,
yeah,
but I think Ramana Maharshi, his goal with that teaching was to get people to really like internalize that question. It's not just saying the words. It's like you have to really wonder that.
yeah. It's when I've been trying to
And it's
practice
kind
it
of
and
it's
reading
kind
on
of
it.
terrifying because you don't really arrive. There's no like answer like ding, oh yeah, you're this, and like you understand everything all of a sudden. It's basically like it's just
Beyond
like a
it.
goal. It's just like a a, a way to disarm the ego, I think, is
Yeah.
how I describe it.
No,
And
definitely I've
what
heard.
and whatever experience you arrive at beyond that is like, I don't know, maybe it's so beyond the intellect or whatever that you can't describe it, but I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, from what I've learned about it, uh yeah, first of all, you said exact like the point from what I understand is it's a lot more nuanced and complex than just who am I and then just saying that over and over again
Yeah,
because like I think what Ramana Maharshi taught a couple times is to say who am I and then to use that as a guide to get you back to stillness and thoughtlessness once your mind has wandered off. So it's kind
yeah,
of like meditation in that sense where you're just bringing your mind back. But for him, it's like you're thinking, all right, who is thinking? And then you realize, that's not me. I mean, I'm seeing my thoughts. Obviously, I'm not my
yeah.
thoughts. And just using that to get back to that state of wondering without using the intellect. I don't know. It's complicated. It takes practice for sure.
Yeah, I think um I think part of what he's trying to get at least in my perspective, is like, can you experience uh can you experience like just the feeling of like I exist, you know,
Yeah.
without having any thoughts or any sort of explanation or narrative surrounding who you are as an individual. But but I think the goal of that practice is to get us to like to see ourselves as something that's beyond definition, just the feeling of like I am, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Like to yeah.
Like when you realize that that's his other thing. His big thing, I read one of his books or someone, I think the guy's name is David Godman, who basically is like the only, not the only guy, but like he's the master of, he studied Ramana Maharshi's teachings, almost only his teachings for his entire life. And basically the whole idea that he said Ramana Maharshi's trying to convey is get that I am. Like that's the central theme is I am.
Yeah.
You use who am I to get to the I am, and you can't explain what I am. It just, you just are, and you just
Yeah.
realize, yeah, I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my emotions. Obviously, I observe my thoughts and emotions and my who I think I am, and because I observe them, that means that they're not me. Or that, I think that's another technique,
Mm.
but it's a very similar technique, and
The neti
the
method.
neti, yeah, meditation. And
I'm not I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my body, and you can kind of rationalize why that's so. Yeah.
but I think the neti it'll, and Ramana Maharshi's method, I think they're still, I mean, obviously they're trying to arise at the same goal, but they're using it like, all right, once you realize that you're not uh, your thoughts or your body or whatever, then use that understanding to go beyond your thoughts. And like
Hmm.
once you get to that point where you understand that you are none of these, then your work is, don't keep questioning what you are, or don't keep like thinking that the intellect is going to understand what you are. Then it's like,
Yeah.
all right, now I know that I'm not all these things, then who am I? And then just sitting there and
Have
without
you
knowing who
ever
you are.
have you ever done a sensory deprivation tank?
Oh yeah, dude, I love those.
You have?
Yeah, have you? I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I did one time. But yeah, I had one experience in when I did the sensory deprivation tank where I feel like um definitely didn't like I don't think I succeeded in that practice, but in that tank I like understood what Ramana Maharshi was talking about of like how you can observe your thoughts and stuff
Yeah.
and understand that they're different from you because it was such a strange experience. Like the water is the exact temperature of your body, so you
Yeah.
don't feel any if you don't move, you you can't feel your body because you have no reference point for where what your skin is touching, you know?
Yeah, like immediately you kind of feel it and then it just kind of goes away, that
It's
you
so
just forget
weird,
about
yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, and you lose all reference of like where your body is in a way.
Yeah.
And yeah, I feel like that's a good place to practice Ramana Maharshi's teachings.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the biggest hindrances I think is there's so many distractions. It's so hard to get to
Oh
that
yeah.
point where you're able to, I guess that's one of the eight limbs of yoga, right? Concentration. It's so hard
Hmm.
in our modern culture because of technology, because of everything we have, to build up that concentration where you can get to the beginning point of,
Yeah.
all right, I have the enough concentration to question who am I and sit in that state without getting distracted every 5 seconds, you know?
Yeah,
And
and
that's why
to
sensory
accomplish
deprivation tends.
anything,
Yeah.
even non-spiritual stuff like yeah, it's like
Yeah.
I think I read a quote. I think it was Andrew Carnegie, the the steel magnate. at the
Yeah.
turn of the 20th century. He was being interviewed for a newspaper article, and they said, what's the secret to your success? And he said, you really want me to tell you? And they're like, yeah. And he goes, I can concentrate on one task for 5 minutes. And in his view, I think he said like only 15% of people can actually do that. Something
Yeah.
like that. So yeah, it's concentration is key. Like,
In
yeah,
in
I think,
anything in life, but
oh yeah,
meditation especially, it's
I
I
think
mean,
that's the biggest, I think that's definitely if we want to look at meditation of like, how can it benefit us in our, work lives, family lives, our kind of normal daily lives? Definitely that aspect is that you can do specific types of meditation that are considered, in Patanjali's definition as dharana, which is it's not quite yet meditation. It's just practicing concentration. And then in Patanjali's view, when you perfect concentration, when your concentration becomes so one pointed, what actually happens is the the you in your concentration and the thing you're concentrated on suddenly like merge, and then like there's just this flow of concentration. They say it's like pouring a stream of oil from a vase, and it's just like a constant like stream, and you're no longer really trying. That's what's considered, then you've moved to dhyana or meditation. And then as you get deeper and deeper familiarized with that experience, then samadhi comes.
yeah,
So I can't
exactly.
I can't say I've really experienced that to its fullest extent.
Same.
Um, I'd say I've had little experiences of that deep meditation, but I can't say I've really experienced the samadhi state.
Yeah, same. I can't say I've experienced one either. I mean, I think yeah, the biggest goal I've seen in the West, there's this huge thing with mindfulness meditation. I used to be obsessed with mindfulness,
Uh-huh.
and when I look back on trying to understand mindfulness, it's like it's basically a concentration meditation. It's
Yeah,
continually bringing your awareness back to the breath in order to build up concentration. That's like the main theme. Like mindfulness, you're not trying to have an awakening and reach samadhi through mindfulness. No, it's kind of just let's build up a concentration to increase my well-being because I'm not constantly thinking all these thoughts, and I have enough concentration to at certain moments of the day to bring myself back.
yeah. A concentration of like what's going on around you and
Yeah,
with your body.
exactly. And I think that's a lot of the same ideas in Zen meditation as well. It's like
Hmm.
in Zen, it's like I always try to understand what Zen is, and I still don't have a good understanding of it. And because like it seems like it's similar to mindfulness where you're trying to build up concentration
For
and
sure, yeah.
and bring
I'd say that
yourself
my
back.
I'd say that mindfulness uh probably comes is that what we consider as like Western modern like mindfulness meditation.
Yeah,
I'd say that comes from Zen mostly.
definitely.
Definitely from Buddhism, but mostly from Zen, because Zen emphasizes just that simplicity. Like the only practice in Zen is this idea of like just trying to be so present and not really focusing on anything in particular. But this idea, I forget who wrote it, but there's this famous Zen teacher who said like, how do you practice Zen? Well, when you eat, just eat. Like when you're chopping wood, just chop wood. And when you go to sleep, like just be tired and go to sleep. Like, and it sounds kind of like okay, that I didn't really learn much from that, but I think it's this idea of like you should in Zen, it's like you should learn how to do something, and be so present that you literally have no like mental noise or commentary about what you're doing. It's like you just become one with like whatever you're doing. It's like
Yeah,
that
exactly.
flow state, if you've heard about that term.
Yeah, definitely. Flow. I was
Yeah.
reading a book about flow, and I saw so many similarities to these mystical type experiences we're talking about here. It's like,
Yeah,
yeah, when
I think it's really cool that the flow state thing is becoming popular, because yeah, that is a mystical experience. I
yeah,
think like
like
in kind of
when
a
they try to
Western, yeah,
when you read explanations of what flow is, it's like, yeah, time slows down. You have no sense of self. You're completely focused effortlessly on whatever you're doing in the here and the now. It's like that's basically a mystical experience, right?
oh yeah, that's a lot of mystical experiences are described just like that. So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. And but yeah, when I back to Zen too, it's like when you try to understand Zen, it's so hard because I saw this saying once in from a Zen master. He's like, when you think you've understood Zen, that's when you haven't understood it. Like the minute you think you have, and then you've got it wrong. It's like
Hmm.
they're talking about Zen as, I think that's where a lot of the Eastern traditions relate. It's like when you're talking about Zen, I don't know if this is true or not, but I think that what Buddhists call like Zen, or like what people that practice Zen, like just that to them, I think Zen is like the same as Nirvana or Samadhi or whatever. It's just
Yeah,
like it's like their word for
yeah.
union, and like that they
And
practice
Zen
meditation.
traditions actually use the term samadhi quite a bit.
Yeah,
So they have the same understanding of that state.
yeah. And yeah, they use their Zen practices because they have the same understanding. They're trying to reach samadhi in this internal state. And that's why like a big thing in Buddhism is koans, right?
Yeah, yeah,
It's like you can't understand it. That's why we're going to give you this riddle to help you try to go beyond your understanding,
yeah.
somewhere to uh, Jnana yoga as well.
Jnana, yeah, yeah. That is a really interesting similarity. It's like it's like a problem that's meant to like disorient your intellect so that it like slips and then you can see beyond it, kind of.
Yeah,
That
it's
doesn't have an answer, it's meant to confuse you.
yeah. Like
Like what's that?
the first one
Like
I think of
yeah.
is what's the sound of one hand clapping?
That's what I was just gonna say. Yeah, yeah. That's a really weird one. Like, yeah.
Yeah, it's
To
like
think about that, it just makes you feel kind of uneasy. You're like, I don't.
I
Weird.
don't know. Yeah, that's it's supposed to, right?
Yeah, that I think that's the goal.
Yeah, because a lot of it is uh, a lot of these practices make you feel uneasy because we live our lives in this we don't live like this. Like we don't live in a way where we're constantly in union. We constantly have this experience. We live on a
Yeah,
and constantly in our minds thinking about everything, and then the minute you go beyond it, it's kind of uncomfortable because it's like I just want the comfort of my thinking back, my thinking
yeah,
mind.
yeah.
And
Well, because I think in the West, so much of we value like it's important to know in our society like who you are. Like in our praxis program, we're talking about our personal brand and stuff.
yeah, that's yeah,
And in order to like to succeed in the world, you kind of got to know who you are and have some context of yourself. So I think specific or especially in Western society, it's kind of scary to it's a survival instinct that we don't want to lose that context of ourselves within society, because our survival very much depends on that.
yeah, yeah. Like a lot of the drive in Western society is to become somebody, to attain success. And like something I really
Yeah.
liked was, I remember what's it, the movie 7 Years in Tibet, or there's a book as well.
Yeah. With
And
Brad Pitt, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the lines in it is it's like this Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist, because that's who the main guy Heinrich is trying to he's going to Tibet to escape the war. He's a refugee of the war, and he meets this Buddhist, and the Buddhist tells him, in your society you see success as whoever can climb the highest mountain, because he's a mountaineer. It's like, in
Hmm.
our society we see success as whoever has the smallest ego, whoever's the
Hmm.
most humble.
Yeah.
And that's kind of portrays like in our lives, it's like, who are you, what can you achieve, what are you going to do. And there's, in their context, it's like, how deep can you go into realizing that you're none of that. That's not you, right?
Yeah. It's really it's really totally opposite.
Yeah,
And that's one thing that I've been trying to wrap my head around and understand is like, how can we how can I how can you have both sides of it? How can you, is it possible to uh try to pursue transcending your ego, whatever that looks like, and also um you know make your ego into something that is can succeed in the world.
yeah. I exactly, that's like a lot of the struggle that I've had whenever I study this stuff. It's like, can I find this balance where I'm still furthering my growth on an inner level, and I'm understanding deeper things, but I still function perfectly in in building, not building up my
Yeah.
ego, but like in, I think I'd like to believe that it's possible. I mean,
Yeah,
in a lot of these books, you're like,
for sure.
there's this common idea of like ego death. It's like, I have to kill my ego. It's like, a lot, that's just not true. It's like, you
Yeah,
have to learn how to work with your ego so that you're not constantly battling against it. And like,
exactly. Yeah, and you have to make sure you're excuse me. I haven't talked this much in a long time, so my throat's like, what's going on?
yeah,
um but yeah, I forgot who wrote this, but there's this thing I read that's like, you shouldn't always be trying to like destroy your ego. You should be trying to rather purify it and make it something that's not like um harmful to yourself and others.
yeah,
You're not doing stuff uh based on greed and like these lower kind of manifestations of how ego can lead us astray of things that actually aren't in our own best nature, but we don't see it at the time.
yeah. I think a lot of the I've heard that same concept, but it's like using a lot of, I don't remember, I feel like I've heard this from many different sources, but they're like, when you're doing spirituality, you can't just always live in this absolute experience. They call it like absolute truth, absolute, like complete unity. That's what they call like absolute truth. Like, you still have to live with relative truth, which is like, this is my name, this is who I am, this is how I function in the world. It's like, a lot of spirituality is understanding, living in the relative, but understanding that it is relative and that there is a different type of truth, I guess.
Yeah, I
And
totally agree with that.
yeah.
That's kind of my personal worldview,
Hmm.
is that I think um, for whatever reason that I think my personal perspective is that we do all have this deeper part of us, this
Yeah.
this kind of uh, divine self, or this part of us that's able to understand things, or from a perspective that's more transcendental. I think that is possible, but I also think like you shouldn't. I don't think escapism is healthy.
No.
I think there's some purpose, or there's something to be learned of, like, how can we understand both? Like, how can we what can we learn from that higher understanding of ourselves, that then we can go into the world of duality and interact with it in a way that's now more enlightened. I think
Yeah,
I
living.
think that's where the I think that's something really valuable.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen like online, or been in this trap before of thinking that the only goal is to understand the absolute truth, and the only goal is to go super deep into meditation, and that's the only thing where you'll reach happiness, or like oh yeah, the mind can't take you to happiness. Only understanding your true nature will. It's like but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't live on in the relative world, and
Yeah,
function in society, right? It's like that's why, I mean, people become ascetics and devote their entire lives to it, but that doesn't mean that. I think that the central point in the Bhagavad Gita is like live within society, but be
yeah,
detached, where you understand. You still the Bhagavad Gita. I think it's teaching you how to be spiritual within society and
totally.
within whatever you're doing, right?
Yeah,
And
because the central story is like, um, what's his name? Arjuna is on the battlefield, and he doesn't want to fight this battle, and then Krishna's like, actually, this whole battle isn't like as real as it seems. All these people are really spiritual beings and stuff, and so he's kind of saying like it's not good to like just decide to not play the game of life.
yeah,
You should play the game with the understanding that it's a game. Is kind I think
yeah,
kind of can be understood, the central message of that. But there's other interpretations of the Gita. Some people believe that the Gita is the whole thing is an allegory for our own inner world, and they'll even go so far as to say that, like, so Arjuna's on a chariot in the story, right? And Krishna is in front of him holding the reins of the chariot. So they would even say that, the chariot has five horses in the story, that the five horses are like our five senses, and the chariot is our body, and Arjuna is like our intellectual mind, and Krishna is like our true self with a capital S. So
yeah,
there's even interpretations so far of like, you know, uh, it's the battlefield of our own inner life, or tying it back to what we were talking about within Islam, like the inner jihad. It's that stage of that battle going on.
it's a
But on but on the
living
other
a
hand, the Gita has also been used to justify actual wars a few times in Indian history. Um, so yeah, it's
it's
complex like anything else
yeah,
in this realm.
exactly. That's why, like, one of the things I see is sometimes you start talking about all these deep Hindu concepts of like union and everything. It's like, but Hinduism isn't perfect, and I mean, obviously, like, stuff happens within Hinduism that people still use it to accomplish, take control, take power, to
Yeah,
start wars. It's like it's not perfect, but uh, if you
I
look
mean the
into it, it just teaches you certain
yeah,
practices. It's not something to follow word by word, right?
yeah,
And something I might add is earlier we were talking about, like, in the West we want to become somebody. In the East it's like I just want to be humble, and you want to transcend your egoic desires and everything. Uh,
One thing I was
Recent,
gonna, if I might interject, one thing that
yeah,
came to mind with that is that, in a lot of Eastern cultures, especially in India, they have a place in their society for people who, for the monks, for
yeah,
people who do like want nothing to do with this world. They're not going to work. They're not going to do anything. They're going to devote all their time to spiritual practices. And they have a place in their society for those people, and they have a support system for them because they think that's valid.
yeah,
But
because yeah,
we don't have that here. So I mean, you can, uh, I'm sure join some sort of monastery. I mean, there's monasteries here, but it's definitely not an accepted part of our culture here.
yeah, exactly. Like it's just they view that same thing because of their spiritual and religious understanding or their perspective on spirituality. They, yeah, like you said, they see that as a viable option, right?
Yeah.
And a recent, I mean, I think you're starting to see a little bit of an a rise of this idea of these ideas in Western culture. I mean, we wouldn't be talking about it if it. I mean, with the internet and everything, you can understand it, and by studying religious studies and everything. But a recent example I saw was, you know who Ram Dass is?
Yeah.
He just came out with, they made a film called Becoming Nobody.
Oh yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah, so it's like basically the idea behind that is everyone's trying to become nobody. Our goal is to become somebody in this world, and our goal is to become nobody. And
Yeah.
I mean, especially like Alan Watts too. It's huge explosion, right? Like
Yeah.
the number of people that listen to Alan Watts is insane. It's like, yeah, he's just talking about these Eastern mystical ideas that have been around for millennia, right?
Yeah.
But
Hey, would you mind if I grab some water really quick?
yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. It's well, it makes me think of like, can you become nobody and have that experience and understand that place of yourself where you are quote unquote nobody, and then can you like bring value to the world, come back from that experience? I
Yeah.
think that's
What
I think that's something worth pursuing for sure.
exactly? Like when you said that, it made me think of sorry, uh, like you said, like with praxis and everything, we're doing all this stuff to build up our who we like think we are, who we want to become, and understanding that. It's
Mhm.
like I think with becoming nobody, it's can you be become somebody, but without identifying with that person and not thinking that's who you are, and like understanding
Yeah,
there's a deeper sense while you're still taking action and attaining what Westerners would call success. You're making money, you're living your life, but you understand that that's not you're not identifying to that as that's who you are. You're this guy that makes money, and
totally. It's like you might become financially successful, and then if that market you're in just crashes and gets replaced by some innovation, is your identity destroyed with that? Like, do you
yeah,
have a mental breakdown because all you knew yourself to be was like uh the guy who created Blockbuster? Like,
yeah,
uh so yeah, I think that's hugely important. You got
yeah.
to have a deeper understanding of yourself that's not going to be blown down in the storms of life.
I mean, I think that's what the concept of detachment. It's like I can function in this world and be detached from it. I'm not, or I think what they how they define detachment is like uh doing something without expecting a certain result. You're just doing it. You're still taking action every single day, but you're not basing your happiness on what comes out of that action. You're basing your happiness off the action itself, right?
Yeah, not being attached to the fruits of your action
Yeah, yeah,
is
that's what
the,
it
the
is.
way the Gita puts it. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a really interesting idea because uh yeah, it's like, well, why are you doing something unless you want to win or whatever, right?
yeah,
It's like, why are you playing in the football game unless you want to win? It's like, you're not you might think like, well, you're not going to play very well if you're just like, well, I don't care if I win or lose. I'm not going to be attached to that end result or the fruits of my action. I'm just going to play and we'll see what happens. Um so
but
it's kind of
it's
a
different though. Yeah,
yeah, it's kind of a weird idea because I think it is possible to like do something and do a really good job, but uh but then if you succeed, to not like totally build yourself, to not use that to like build up your ego in kind of a negative way,
yeah,
right? And then if you lose, to I think even in the sense of losing or failing at something, not getting the result you wanted, that can also build up your ego because then you become like you're like see yourself as a victim, and
exactly.
that's another that's another manifestation of like negative ego. I think is like, thinking you're a victim, thinking or like low self-esteem, like, oh, I'm not good enough, self-pity. I think that's another manifestation of the ego that you have to watch out for.
Yeah, for sure. When people think of ego, it's like, oh, that guy's a big ego, right? He has a bit high self esteem, but like there's
Yeah,
low self esteem examples of ego too. It's like it's just the ego is just. I mean, how do you? I hate using that word, like, because it gets thrown around so much. But it's like, what is
yeah,
the ego? It's just like the thoughts that are constantly going through your minds of who you think you are, and
yeah,
no matter if that's good or bad, right?
yeah. And it's, the way I like to think of it too is like the thoughts you think about yourself from usually from a really narrow perspective.
Yeah,
It's like, you might you might think these really you might have really low self-esteem and have all this like self-loathing going on, but really like you're just wrapped up in your own thoughts, and other people don't really perceive you that way, but you have no idea. You're just so caught up in your own perception of yourself. This might not even be true. And you're not going to say to someone who's like, has horrible self-esteem, like, hey, stop being so egotistical, what's your problem.
yeah,
But I think that's definitely a manifestation of like egoism,
yeah, definitely. And
because in most senses it's like a skewed vision of yourself. And I think what the Gita is trying to get at is like, can you do something, and either if you win or lose, can you uh like not let that affect you so much?
yeah, I remember.
Can you not then, is it possible to then not like change your definition of yourself based on how the what the results are?
Yeah, I think when they talk about suffering and ending suffering, the big thing is like we suffer when we're too attached to the goal. We suffer when we base our happiness on external things, right?
Yeah,
On our actions, on the fruits of our actions, and
because all that changes.
yeah, because you can't control anything. You the only way I think their teachings, if I had to boil them down, it's base your happiness on your inner state, or like be able to not manufacture, but be able to be content with whatever's happening
Yeah.
because you're in such a place that you're not basing your happiness on anything external, because you've gotten to a point where you've done such practice. And that's what I ask a lot too, is how do I get to that point, right? Is
Hmm.
I want to get to that point where I base my I base my where I don't let external things affect my emotions, right? I want to get to that
Yeah.
point where I'm not like, I have to get this job, I have to do this, I have to accomplish this in order to be happy.
Yeah.
And a big thing is learning how to uh, I think I was reading this book recently, which basically talks all about how to stop the root cause of suffering. It's like we suffer because we argue with what is. We want the past to be different, or we want the future. We're basing our happiness off something once we reach it in the future, or we're becoming unhappy because we're wrestling with something that happened in the past. And like the way to the inner journey is just learning how to live with what is, and to not always wrestle wanting things to be different than they are and thinking we have more control than we actually do. And I had something I was gonna say, but I forgot. if I
Yeah.
if I remember it.
I think that's a useful practice for sure.
Or yeah, that's what it was. Like,
Because
I
I think
guess,
it's
what
true that,
practices?
yeah, definitely most of what we suffer from is just like our own worries. I
Yeah,
mean, in our society, like definitely, if you're if you're living in the woods and there's a grizzly bear gnawing on your leg, um, that's gonna suck. No, even if you're, especially if you're really present in the moment. So,
yeah,
but I think like definitely most of the stuff that we suffer from is just it's our own stories we run in our heads about how things are going to turn out in the future, how we screwed this up in the past, and we let those things define us. Which, yeah, I think that's for sure true.
yeah. And that, I think that's a big part of meditation, and that's why finding a meditation practice that works in your life is very helpful, because like it's insanely challenging to uh to not be in that state of worry or rumination or constantly
Yeah.
thinking about stuff. And like meditation is kind of the avenue towards being more present and not letting them
Mhm.
affect you as much, I guess.
One of my favorite descriptions of meditation or quotes about meditation
Yeah,
was from this Tibetan guy. I think his name was Songyal Rinpoche. It was a video on YouTube, and he said, "Meditation makes your mind non-stick, like those frying pans that are non-stick surface."
yeah,
He said meditation makes your mind non-stick, so like you still have the thoughts and stuff, but they don't stick to you anymore. They just slide off, and that's the difference between suffering and freedom. Really, is like
yeah.
you can still have negative thoughts and stuff, but you latch on to them and then and identify with them.
Oh
that's
yeah,
that's the key.
for sure. Like, uh I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about meditation. It's that I've meditated with this idea before, and I mean, that's what the person that doesn't meditate, that's typically what they think about meditation. It's like, I have to meditate and get rid of all the thoughts in my mind. As soon as
Hmm.
I have a thought, dang, I failed. Like,
Oh, it's so not true.
that's
Yeah.
completely the opposite. The whole point is like,
If you go into meditation with that perspective, like, oh, the goal is to have no thoughts, like that sounds miserable.
yeah,
I
it's
mean, it
just
is
never gonna
miserable.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And the
the
ironic thing is that, you know, you definitely can get to a state where you're not having any thoughts, but the surest way to not achieve that state is to try and achieve just that state, you know?
yeah,
Like,
exactly.
because then it's like you're just creating so much like mental and even physiological tension in your body sitting to meditate when you're just like you're trying to stop your mind, you know? That's
Yeah, it does not work.
not gonna work at all.
It's especially like even like mindfulness too. It's like mindfulness, try to get rid of your thoughts. It's like, no, mindfulness is about being able to witness your thoughts and then come back to the present moment. Like,
Yeah.
I think the big thing about meditation is thoughts aren't bad. Thoughts aren't inherently good or bad. They just are. And the whole point of meditation is to be able to see when they arise. It's like, oh, there's a thought, back to the present. Like, not, oh, there's a thought, I better go down this rabbit hole of, I mean, obviously you don't think that, but getting from a point where from the unexperienced or the person that doesn't have any experience in meditation, when a thought arises, they'll just follow it and they'll be lost in thought for however many minutes. Then the
Yeah.
meditator, the same thought comes up, they're like, there's a thought, back to the present, or like, or not even like back to the present moment. It's like, here's the thought arising in the present, I'm witnessing it and it's fading away. It's like they're
It's
able
like
to
in
stay present because they witness thoughts arising instead of
yeah.
following them.
Yeah, I was gonna say in Tibetan Buddhism they call that the thoughts self-liberate. It's like you don't have to push them away. You don't have to like get rid of them in any conscious manner. Just by trying to not attach to them,
Yeah,
or I should say, like, I guess that kind of I guess that accurately portrays what I'm trying to say. Like, not attaching to them, uh, they just go away. Like, they free themselves,
yeah,
which is
exactly.
interesting. But I think that's definitely true. Like,
And
just kind of how the mind works. It's like Buddhism is sometimes called a science of the mind.
I love that
And
definition.
yeah, and the Buddha said, like, you know, you don't have to, he encouraged skepticism. He said, don't just blindly accept these things that I'm telling you
Yeah,
about the nature of your own mind. Like, I'm talking about your mind too. Go and and try and verify them for yourselves. And yeah, I think it's not too hard to verify some of these things. Like, you know, you can perceive that your thoughts will self-liberate.
yeah, and
It
like
happens.
that same idea of self-liberating thoughts. It's like what we talked about earlier. It's Yana yoga. It's like when you do self-inquiry, a primary point in that is like being able to witness your thoughts and understanding that because you're witnessing them, you're not the thinker of your thoughts. And it's like when a thought arises, I'm not the one who thought it. I'm just the witness of it, and it'll pass on its own. And because
Hmm.
like a lot of times when we don't make that distinction, when we're like, I mean, we don't actually tell ourselves I am my thoughts, but we identify with them in a way where it's like,
Yeah.
I think I'm the one thinking my thoughts, and that's why I suffer, because instead of realizing, oh, thoughts arise, thoughts pass, and I'm just a witness, right?
Yeah. I remember when I first started to get serious about meditation practice. I think I was like I think I was like 19 when I first started to actually try to meditate on a regular basis.
Yeah,
And I remember when I first started meditating, I really went into it with like a fervor. You know, there's this saying in Zen that you should meditate like your hair is on fire, like with that level of intensity, like not tension, I would say. Can you
yeah,
can interpret it that way as like tensing up, but like you should have such a definiteness of purpose and like almost like a devotion from
yeah,
your heart, like that uh, you want to meditate well, like you're not
Yeah.
just like, okay,
Yeah.
I have to sit here for an hour, let's get it over with, you know.
Yeah. It's not.
So
Yeah. Exactly.
so when I first started meditating, I really had this like fervor because I was really like, man, I want to experience what Patanjali is talking about, what the Gita is talking about, like. And at that time in my life, I was kind of having like an existential crisis. I was I was trying to think about who I am, uh, going forward. What career do I want to pursue? I had no idea, and so all this really culminated in, for me, with spirituality and like meditation and like me trying to really find out who I am from almost like an existential need I had at that point in my life for that. And I remember like there was this time when it was definitely not the first time I tried meditating, but it was within that first year where it was like for the first time I experienced like um myself being like separate. I experienced this like separation with my thoughts, and I was just realized, I was like, holy shit, my whole life I've just been on this like insane merry-go-round that is my mind, and I've been like latched on to my thoughts. Wherever my mind took me, that's where I went, and that's where what I identified with. And for the first time, it actually physically felt like I like flew off the merry-go-round, and I had a sensation of like landing, you know, and stillness. And all of a sudden, there was
Yeah.
like my point of reference almost like physically felt like I shifted, my my body like moved over 2 feet to the right, and it was really strange experience.
Yeah.
And there was like this stillness and this quiet and this sense of like just being so present that I had never experienced before. And that, for me, that moment really convinced me of like, okay, uh we as humans, or at least, I thought, if this is happening to me, like, I didn't think I was unusually crazy or anything. Like, I was like, wow,
Yeah.
this really is a human problem. Like, Buddha is right, we are so caught up in our minds. And I was like, man, uh I my whole life I've been like hopeless. I've been like really trapped in my mind,
Yeah.
and it's been causing me a lot of problems. And I realized that, and it was really powerful experience.
Yeah. For
And it's
sure.
difficult, I think, for most people. It was certainly difficult for me to like um kind of like get some freedom from that, to achieve to achieve a little freedom in that area. It can be really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely agree with that. I mean, a lot, because we're so attached to our thinking, it creates that difficulty of, in order to understand, to be able to sit in silence is um we have to let go a bit of control to our thinking mind, and we kind of have to we have to be open enough to be like, maybe there is something different, and then meditating on that, it's like, that's when you kind of, it creates the space within you where you actually can experience that shift. And in my life, can't say I've had the same experience, because I went at it from a little bit different perspective. And we're like, I started reading all these spiritual books, and then I'm like trying. That's a problem in my meditations. I'm like trying to have this experience. Like, how can I realize that I'm different from my thoughts? And the act of trying to have that experience deters you from actually experiencing it, right? Because it just takes meditation in a different perspective, but yeah, exactly
Yeah,
what you're saying.
I think like chasing after the mystical experience is definitely a pitfall
Yeah,
because um yeah, you're contriving some sort of experience, some sort of idea about how you think meditation should be,
yeah,
and that totally prevents you from actually experiencing meditation because by doing the former, the first thing, by like trying to, have this profound meditation experience, you're just caught up in your mind because that's just an idea you have in your mind about what you're supposed to experience while you're sitting in meditation and doing this practice. And that's like one of those paradoxes, like in Zen. I forgot who wrote this, but some Zen masters wrote like, above all, to succeed in Zen, don't try to become a Buddha.
yeah,
It's like, well, what? But I think that's what he's getting at. It's like you shouldn't try to aim for this like idea of what you think this enlightenment is like, because that's really not it. It's just an idea you have of it.
yeah. I remember seeing some guy online who practices meditation, not like some spiritual teacher, but just some guy who's sharing his story. This is my spiritual path, and he's like, one of the biggest realizations I had, I think he said, is I was meditating. This guy like travels to India and stuff, tries to study under these Hindu guys, and he said my one of my most profound experiences is understanding that when I was meditating, I constantly had the thought, am I meditating right? Am I meditating right? Is this right? Is this right? And then he's like, once I finally realized that I was thinking about if I was doing it right, when I dropped that thought, that's when my meditation
Yeah.
became deeper. Is
Oh
the
yeah.
the instant I dropped the am I meditating right thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. And I think that's hard to do because that requires us to like, you know, many of us aren't used to or have had really any experience, at least consciously, of living in a state of like outside of our kind of narrative we're constantly creating in our mind about our experience.
Yeah,
And at least in my experience, when I first started to at least kind of touch those states of kind of having a little separation with my thoughts, there's a feeling of uncertainty there, of unfamiliarity. You feel like you're in a new territory.
yeah, exactly.
And I think that's scary for some people. I think some people, a lot of people, especially in our culture, they they instinctively are terrified of that experience
Yeah,
because they uh, they're so identified with their egos that if that experience, I don't know if you'd want to call it like destruction of the ego, but it's like poking a hole in it, and letting the sun come through
yeah,
and seeing like, oh, this ego I thought I was is just like a paper tiger, and I just poked a hole in it. And I think a lot of people are scared of that because they are so identified with that egoic part of themselves.
definitely. And
It can cause some disassociation, and reframing of who you are.
it's definitely not like, because of its nature, where all these get what you hear when you are learning about this experience is that it's beyond the intellect, and it's like, because of the fact that it's beyond the intellect, it's kind of scary. It's like, I found one of the biggest things in my meditation currently that I'm like trying to learn how to get over is like the the wanting to meditate right pitfall. It's like, I just want to learn. I thinking that I need to learn more about meditation in order to transcend the intellect. It's like, maybe I'm just scared of letting go and into the present moment and having this experience, right? And I was gonna say something else, but oh yeah, that's what it was. Another pitfall that I realized too is within the spiritual community, it's like there's so many different traps you can fall into, and one of them is thinking that because you meditate, you're more spiritual, or it's like looking at people.
Makes your
Uh,
ego even bigger.
yeah, like they call it like the spiritual ego. It's like
Yeah,
all these people aren't meditating. They don't understand this experience. I've
yeah,
had this experience, therefore I'm better than everyone because I've had this spiritual experience. And it's like,
yeah.
no.
Yeah, I think I see that a lot, and I'm not gonna say I'm so free of ego, but
Yeah.
and maybe when I see it in other people, it's just a projection of my own ego or something. I don't know, but uh, yeah, you definitely see that a lot. I think, especially in going to spiritual type events and talks and stuff by these so-called gurus.
Yeah.
I've gone to a fair share of those in my life, and yeah, you definitely see that. I see that with, ironically, with like hippie type people a
Yeah.
lot too. Is like their whole kind of self image is built up on like being so conscious and but then you really get to know some of these people and they're just like super judgmental of everyone else, and it's like, you know, is that really being conscious, or are you just being putting yourself above everyone else? I find
Yeah.
I find that's pretty common.
Yeah. Very common in like in so many different communities too. And even like you see it like those type of people, and I hate to narrow it down to one group of people, but if I see this a lot with people that are vegan.
Oh, of course,
It's
yeah.
like
Yeah,
you can't become a vegan without like coming in contact with dozens of people who think they're better than everyone else because they're vegan.
oh yeah,
It's like the point is to eat healthier, not to build up your ego and think you're better than everyone because you're eating healthier or whatever.
yeah. And I think they're even going off on a tangent on that. I think there's even something more about veganism, is that veganism, it's basically impossible to get B vitamins through a vegan diet.
Yeah,
And one of the s-
B12.
yeah, and one
Yeah.
of the symptoms, proven symptoms of B vitamin deficiency is that it starts to affect your mood, and it makes you have manic behavior. So I think that actually explains a lot of like not even being funny, like I actually think that explains a lot of how vegans behave,
Yeah, it's definitely possible. I
unfortunately.
did not. Yeah, because I've been in that place. It's like not to say that all their information is bad. It's like, yeah, if we eat less meat, we might probably be healthier, but to the point of making meat an inherently negative object. It's like all meat is bad. We can't eat meat. It's like, yeah, I want to eat more vegetables. That doesn't mean I want to cut out meat from my diet
Yeah.
entirely. But that's a tangent.
Yeah, I don't personally think veganism is healthy by any means.
No.
There's no place, there's no instant of uh, fifth generation vegan. You can't really find it. That's what I've read.
Yeah.
Um, because you'll become infertile, and even first generation vegans, a lot of them become infertile, especially the women. They'll start menopause in like when they're 30. Some vegan women.
That's crazy.
Um,
Well,
and
I
yeah,
mean, if you,
the way I look at diet is like, um, I think if you look at any, uh, and maybe this is even contradicting some of the things I practice with Buddhism and stuff that encourage vegetarianism. But the way I personally look at it is like, if you look at any indigenous culture, So like any culture that is living from like an instinctual basis, you know, they don't have any texts telling them how to live or any anything like that. They're just living instinctually. They all seek out meat in their environment if they can have it because it's the most nutrient dense source of food really in the environment.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say the same exact thing. Like, if you look at any culture throughout history, I guess not any culture. I mean, there's cultures that promote being vegetarian, but like, if you
Yeah, but
looked at
like yeah,
our evolution, like every culture ate meat at some point.
yeah,
There's no
and
like,
like yeah, India has a huge vegetarian culture. Like the probably the well, definitely the most vegetarians in the world, I'd say. I mean, I
yeah,
don't know if that's true, but it's close, for sure. But they eat a lot of dairy in India, and that's the thing is like you can't really. There's certain things you just can't get from plant foods, like B vitamins, vitamin K, vitamin A, bioavailable forms of zinc and other minerals. So yeah, I'm not for veganism.
yeah, me neither. Uh, yeah, I was just gonna say like,
But you know, that is one thing that uh, to touch on like the spiritual aspect of it.
yeah,
That's one thing that I can't really justify because it does bother me to have to kill animals for food.
yeah. There's definitely a
I don't,
moral thing behind it. It's
yeah,
like
for
I
sure. And I
understand that viewpoint.
yeah, that's a whole different perspective. But yeah,
But when you're looking at it
the way I
from
look at it,
health,
it's like yeah, the way I look at it is uh, you know this might sound like super dumb, but at least in our system today, like most people are not going to become vegan. So basically, the worldwide slaughter of animals isn't going to stop anytime soon, the way I see it. So me deciding to not buy and eat the already dead animals that are in the grocery store, it's not going to save any animals. It's only going to uh, it's only going to waste that meat, you know.
yeah.
So that's kind of the way I look at it, and maybe it's naive, but
Well,
I
even if you're
personally,
looking at it from that perspective, I'd even go as far to say like that might be true, but why don't we just try this shift as a culture of getting more I mean it's so hard to ever know, but getting more uh, better raised animals, and so we're not like
yeah,
packing them in
totally,
cages and like killing them inhumanely. Like there's certain ways
yeah,
some animals are raised and killed better than others. It's not like every animal's the same. I think just like getting more organic meat or more trying to understand the farm to table process more so that we're not getting all these factory farmed animals, right?
hmm and the we're maybe gonna get into this later. You had this question on what do I practice now? So what I practice now is called Kriya Yoga,
Oh,
and
you do? I've
yeah,
been looking at that. It looks super interesting. So
yeah,
it's like a combination of different yogas, right?
yeah, it's great, and I'll go into that later. But I just wanted to mention this one point that so my the guy who the teacher who brought the tradition that I follow to the U.S. His name was Paramhamsa Hari Harananda, and he he said some things about uh, you know, and he encouraged vegetarianism, but he also said he made it clear like being a vegetarian. He said being vegetarian isn't going to make you enlightened because if it did, all the cows would be enlightened or something like that. But
Yeah.
he encouraged like you know you can still uh he kind of encouraged like you know, if you can be vegetarian and you want to, that's good, but it's also okay to follow your own culture and um, to eat according to how you were raised and what you're used to. Don't wreak too much havoc in your life, and it's you can still practice Kriya Yoga, and it's still going to benefit you in the
Yeah.
same way.
Well, how I view diet is like there's so much debate about, is meat good, is meat bad? It's like I see meat as like on the periphery. Like, yeah, we have so much debate about whether it's good or not. I mean, it's probably good for certain people, not for others. I mean, we're all evolved from different parts, like eating different diets, right? But I see it's
Hmm.
like the main thing is like the Western diet. The reason there's so many diseases is because processed foods. Like our
Yeah,
diet is just so bad because we're not actually eating what our ancestors ate. It's like we're not
yeah,
actually eating fruits, vegetables, and meat and fish. It's like, no, we're eating processed everything. Where that's the reason we're not eating real food. We're eating
yeah,
this fake processed food, right?
totally, yeah.
So another thing, I think the reason we got into the whole diet thing is like a lot of spiritual people, they use diet to promote their spiritual
Mm,
ideas and to build up their ego, and they're like, they for like veganism, they think they're more conscious because they're vegan, and then they put down other pe- people that eat other diets, or you're more spiritual because, or you think you're better than others, and you use spirituality as an ego defense mechanism, right?
yeah.
And so let's get into the Kriya practice. I want to hear more about that.
Okay. So yeah, are you familiar with well, I guess I'll just say a little for whoever's for the listeners. So yeah, Kriya Yoga was first brought to the US by a man named Paramhamsa Yogananda. So have you heard that name?
I might have heard it. I'm not familiar with it exactly, though. No.
So he wrote a book that's actually was hugely popular in American culture called Autobiography of a Yogi.
Yeah, I've heard of that book.
So yeah, uh, a lot of people know that book because it came out that at Steve Jobs' funeral, he had written in his will that he wanted these gift bags given out at his funeral to everyone that attended. And the gift bags contained this book, Autobiography of a Yogi. He wrote in his will that he wanted everyone at his funeral to have a copy of this book. Um, Steve Jobs practiced Zen throughout his life and was obviously influenced uh, by the teachings of Yogananda too. So amazing book if you haven't read it. It's just it teaches it talks a lot about the Indian spiritual traditions, but also just super captivating and readable. It's a real page turner. Amazing stories from his life, and yeah, it's a great book. But uh, so this practice has passed down through guru or master and disciple, and he brought it to the U.S. and the school or the tradition that I practice from is not actually, well, it is his tradition, but it's so basically uh, the guy I mentioned earlier, Paramhamsa Hariharananda, who said that thing about if about vegetarianism and cows
Yeah.
being enlightened.
Yep.
So Hariharananda, him, and Yogananda, they were what's called brother disciples. So they had the same guru, who was
All
a
right.
guy named Sri Yukteswar. So they had the same guru. They were brother disciples, and then but Hariharananda was, I think, considerably younger, and at one point he actually learned from Yogananda. So the brother disciple kind of became, in a sense, the not the guru because they still had the same guru, but he took on the teaching role. Yogananda was older than him, I think.
All
So,
right. Yeah.
uh, or yeah, he was considerably older than him.
So
Um,
so Kriya, although it's not the same as the Paramahansa Yoga, the the guy who wrote the autobiography of a yogi, but it's basically inspired deeply by that book, right? Or by that the guy that wrote autobiography of a yogi.
no, it's the same practice.
Oh, it is. All right.
Yeah. So the practice, the specifics of the practice of Kriya Yoga are passed down through teacher to student.
Gotcha.
And so Yogananda brought those teachings to the U.S. In 1920. He arrived in the U.S. and he passed away in 1952. Yogananda did, and Hari Harananda passed away in, man, I want to say like 2001. So he's considerably younger.
Yeah.
So he came. Um, he came to the U.S. much later, like in the 70s, and actually lived in Florida for like 30 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, actually, I think the Kriya Yoga that Yogananda, that his centers that he established teach today, and what I practice are do differ very slightly, but they're basically the same.
And they are similar to pranayama, or I've seen them compared to like kundalini. Isn't Does it consist of a lot of like breathing techniques, or like how would you
Yeah.
explain the actual technique? Like more
So
meditation or breathing or what?
yeah, so the technique of Kriya Yoga, it involves several different techniques, kind of all falling all when they say Kriya Yoga, it's a handful of different techniques that you practice one after the other in sequence, all culminating with silent meditation.
In
So,
in your experience, do you think that the breathing techniques, say if you weren't to do them, would they like do they help you go into silence more? Is like does it more effectively help you like get into that silent state?
definitely, yeah. So yeah, the practices that we do in Kriya Yoga are uh, have a few different aims, specific aims. So number one is to make the spine really flexible and like energized, to have no stiffness in the spine. And then number two is to balance the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And then number three is to to oxygenate the blood really well through breathing. And all those things culminate in making it really easy to go into deep states of meditation. So that's the purpose of it.
So you said you mainly learned this from the autobiography of a yogi, or are there any other like books or references that would help someone? Because I'm looking to get into try Kriya myself.
Yeah. So you can't actually learn the technique in any books. The way that in this tradition, because um, it's within all Indian yoga traditions, the value of the teacher or the master student or teacher student relationship is really important.
Yeah.
So you have to learn it directly from a teacher and receive what's called initiation. And the reason it is that is like, some people criticize that and they say like, oh, because when you take initiation, you promise not to reveal the techniques to anyone who's not initiated. And the reason for that, it's not like because it's so exclusive or anything. The reason to keep that secrecy is really just to protect the integrity of the techniques themselves, because you need to make sure you're learning it from someone who's knows what they're doing and is authorized to do that, or else uh, if someone's practicing the techniques uh, in not the right way, they might actually be able to cause harm to themselves and make themselves mentally imbalanced, or like hurt their back or something. So,
Yeah.
and
So
also the other I'd say main reason of that is, so Kriya Yoga is very much like grounded in the Indian spiritual tradition, in that it's not just like mindfulness. It is a spiritual practice. Um, so the idea is that during initiation, the student, or what's called like I think it's called like the shishyas. I don't know if that's the right term, but the people getting initiated, they're actually like infused with a kind of uh, energy transmission from the teacher or the master, and that if you don't have that, which is kind of like a purifying influence, and you can't really explain it. It's a mystical thing that you can't really.
yeah.
It's not rational. It's
Yeah, there's no reason to like try to debunk it with science or
yeah,
anything. It's just
yeah.
like
You can't.
it's
There's no
something.
reason. I'm not going to sit here and like try to explain that that's real or not. I believe it's real
Yeah.
from my own experience, but yeah. So that's one of the main reasons. It's like before you begin Kriya, you need to have this. Uh, they believe, or we believe that that initiation uh, kind of like blessing, if you will, it purifies your kind of like energy system, and it allows you to practice Kriya. It allows the process, because Kriya is basically based on this idea our of kind of what's called esoteric anatomy, if you will, if you want to put it in like academic terms, but it's
Yeah.
like the idea of the chakras. Have you heard of the chakras?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's the idea that you're purifying the chakras and you're circulating energy around them in order to energize them. And that's why Kriya Yoga is said to it's a practice that is intended for what's called householders. So the the disseminators the masters who first brought Kriya Yoga into being created it not for monks. It's for people who live in the world, who are married, have kids, whatever, have jobs,
Yeah.
because it's not a practice that uh, is going to take you out of the world. So it's thought that the chakras, each like the lowest chakra, the Muladhara, which is at the base of the spine, that's where uh, deals with the energy of like acquiring money, and it's like the stability. Your survival instincts are in that center.
Yeah.
So Kriya Yoga deals with all seven centers. So it's like thought to not just make you more spiritual, but also like make you more effective in the world.
Yeah. So I had a couple questions that arose. So you said there's schools all around the U.S. I'm guessing. I mean, because like first I was like, oh, it must be in India somewhere, but you said one of the guys moved to Florida before he died or something, and so like,
Yeah.
so you're practicing in like in a Korea school, or like how do you go about finding a school to learn Korea? Because like I definitely understand the viewpoint of like teacher student confidentiality and like learning from a teacher, because like for example mindfulness, it's a very watered down practice. If you're
Mm-hmm.
gonna be doing these more intense practices, if you will, um it's definitely like if you do it the wrong way, I can definitely see how it's more effective to learn it directly from the teacher because then you'd actually it wouldn't just be like written instructions. I'm guessing you're actually like seeing what they're doing and kind of replicating it, if you will.
Yeah.
And another thing is within the Korea
Yeah, it's like
school.
a you learn in kind of like a weekend intensive. So you learn there's the initiation ceremony, which is kind of like a it it's a very traditional like Indian yogic ceremony with all sorts of symbolism. You give you offer things that represent like your different aspects of yourself, and there's lots of symbolism. It's kind of like a ritual,
Yeah.
and that's uh, very much maintains this traditional Indian lineage that it comes from, which I
S-
think is really cool.
Is it like some like Vedanta you said, or like do you know, or I
Um,
guess
I'd
yeah.
say I'd say it more comes from the I'm not sure how I would describe that in terms of the initiation ritual itself. I know that uh, I think it more comes from schools of yoga.
Yeah.
Like but also I know in in Vedanta, like in Jnana yoga, there would still be Jnana yoga still very much emphasizes the importance of the master student relationship. And even in Jnana yoga, and yeah, even in Jnana yoga, they would still have these initiation ceremonies. It might just be the guru like touching you and saying a mantra, or whispering something in your right ear was a common thing. Whispering the mantra, and
Yeah.
then you were never supposed to say the mantra out loud. And the mantra might be like the Mahavakyas. Have you heard of these? The great utterances in Jnana Yoga. So they're kind of like saying, "Who am I?" But they're more traditional versions before Ramana Maharshi, and they're phrases you contemplate, like Tattvamasi,
Yeah, I've heard
thou
that one.
art that,
Yeah.
or Shivoham, Shivoham, I am Shiva, like I am uh, the universal consciousness, unmoving consciousness, and stuff.
Yeah.
So there's different forms of initiation rituals, but that's it's interesting. That's one thing I learned and I thought was really fascinating in my study at college in religious studies is that all esoteric traditions place huge emphasis on the direct connection between teacher and student, and that it's like a mystical like transference of knowledge that's beyond just something you could read in a book. It's like a direct experience that the teacher is giving you, and now that lives in you. And like for example in Sufism they have I went down I became really interested in Sufism when I was studying it in school. I took a few classes uh, on that, and there was this guy Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, who's an author. He's an English guy, Caucasian English guy, and he's an author, and he's part of this Sufi tradition called Naqshbandi,
Yeah.
which is a tradition that goes. Um, so this guy Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, this white English guy, is something like 40 40th, or he's he can trace he has literally you can trace from his teacher to their teacher to their teacher to their teacher all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad. And that's
All
something
right.
in Sufism that's really important to them, is that all schools of Sufism trace their lineage in a direct what they call the golden chain from to the Prophet Muhammad. And they believe that because they believe the Prophet Muhammad is was hanging out with the angel Gabriel and having direct revelations from God. So that power from God, they believe, can be passed down through what's called the golden chain from person to person to person. and they take that very seriously, that living lineage. It's like an actual power that lives in the teacher that he gives to the students.
Yeah, and I think
And the same idea in Christianity, you know, with Jesus's 12 disciples and what the Gnostics believe.
yeah, definitely. Like, I think what thoughts came up is that in the West, I feel like we try to objectify everything, that we become close-minded to this idea of like lineages, and like we're not open to the idea of lineages because we're I found myself in this mindset for sure, and I'm always trying to be more open and understanding, and like I've been in this mindset before where I'm like, why would I ever study under a guru? Why would I ever do this initiation? Like, why can't you just read it in a book? Or why can't
Hmm.
there's this like idea that you can just what like it should be objective, and you should just be able to read it in a text or something. It's like this idea of passing down knowledge from student to teacher. It's I think once you start to open up to the idea of like maybe there is some knowledge that can't be accessed in just written word, or
Yeah.
like that you like learn online. It's like it makes me wonder like why do these traditions put so much emphasis on their lineages, or put so much emphasis on the initiation process? There might be something to it if they've it's if it's been passed down for however many generations. And I mean it's probably doing something more than just writing it down and giving it to someone.
Yeah.
And
And I think that's something we do in our Western civilization a lot, is we tend to write off anything that uh, kind of seems like ritual or superstition as,
yeah,
like, you know, that's because we value reason and science in our Western tradition, right?
yeah,
And so those things are seen as antithetical to that. So they must be just BS and thrown out. And I don't. I think in my experience, there is something to investigate about those type of things, and there is some wisdom and something meaningful in ritual. You know, saying like, this thing represents this. I'm going to speak this prayer into this ghee, this clarified butter, and then I'm going to throw it in the fire as I say a mantra. And, like, you know, a lot of these religions have these very ritualistic things. Like in Hinduism and Buddhism, what I was just describing is like a puja, like a fire ceremony. You're
yeah,
you're throwing stuff into the fire symbolically. And I think that's honestly it's something we could benefit from thinking about more in the West. It's like uh, there's a power in ritual, in that you're taking the abstract and you're creating a scenario like a child does when they play they play grown-ups or whatever. They pretend they're pregnant and stuff. I'm the mommy, you're the daddy. They're playing.
yeah,
Kind of like, not the same thing, but it allows us to understand abstract concepts when we can say, okay, this wafer is the body of Christ and this is his blood. And, like, there's some power in that. It hits you at a deeper level than just thinking about it.
yeah, exactly. And
And it
like,
may not be literally true. You might believe, like some Christians believe, that, after this wine is blessed, it literally is Christ's blood. And if you want to believe that, okay. But
there's a different aspect to it where you
yeah,
don't believe it, but you understand the power of the ritual itself, right?
Yeah, this symbolism. That's the way I see rituals, at least.
Yeah. And another thing I just remembered is adding on to the how we try to objectify everything argument for the Western scientific culture, I guess, is that when we see these ritualistic, what all these religions or cultures are doing, where they're doing all these rituals to pass down knowledge, I feel I feel like when from a scientific standpoint, if you look at it that way, it starts to seem a lot like a cult, and we kind of categorize all these different rituals as like, oh, that's a cult, or like,
Yeah.
or I mean, that's more if it's
I
like
mean,
not a major
especially,
religion, but
yeah, especially the whole thing. Anytime you mention like guru,
yeah, yeah,
of course,
exactly,
because I mean, and that's for good reason, because there's been tons of instances of crooked gurus who, manipulate their students, take their money to buy nice houses and drugs, and sexually abuse their students. And
yeah,
yeah, we
yeah,
do have to be careful of that for sure, because that's a very real thing. Like, it happens all the time.
yeah, exactly. Like
Uh,
I was applying for this place in Colorado. I was gonna go be a volunteer there in exchange for housing and access to all these meditation retreats and food and everything. And then the week I was applying, Colorado, I don't know what their newspaper is.
your audio just cut out for a few seconds. I missed what you said. I heard the last thing I heard was you applied for a program in Colorado.
All right, can you hear
Yeah.
now? All right. Uh, yeah. So this last summer, I was applying to a place in Colorado, which it was called the Shambhala Buddhist Meditation Center
Okay. Yeah.
under under some it's like some sect of Buddhism or something.
Yeah.
And then I read,
Chogyam Trungpa's.
yeah, I believe
That's
that's what it is.
Chogyam Trungpa's organization, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. That he's a good example of that. Yeah. So he and some of his students even today will defend him and say, well, that's part of like tantra, that's part of Tibetan Buddhism, is like crazy wisdom,
yeah,
like the he's in a non-dual state, so like doing $100,000 worth of cocaine a year is like, it's not bad because he's doing it. He doesn't see it as bad. He sees like wisdom and everything as pure and stuff. But yeah, he's a perfect example of that,
well,
in my
the
view.
crazy thing is what you're talking about. I hadn't even heard about some of that stuff, but like even like today, like this meditation center in just outside of Boulder, Colorado, I think. They just had a thing written in the newspaper in Colorado where the people that they're still living, they're like still practicing at this meditation center, and they just got certain allegations against them for using students for sex that are under the age of 16 and like stuff like
Yeah,
that. It's like there's definitely a lot to look out for, but that doesn't mean
yeah,
that you shouldn't disregard the whole idea of guru student transfer of knowledge, right?
yeah. Especially in tantric Buddhism, because there's some practices in tantra that involve like um, ritualistic use of alcohol and also sexual practices. So there's tons of stories of the guru going to the cute female student and saying like, oh, let's do this, I'm going to give you this secret sexual practice and no one else is going to get it because I think you're like more enlightened than everyone else, and it's going to advance you spiritually really fast if you do this practice with me. And they're tricked into it because, well, maybe they, yeah, they genuinely think that, like, they believe what the guru is saying, and they're like, okay, this, whatever, if this is a real practice, then if what he's saying is true, then it's going to be good for my spiritual evolution. And then sometime down the road they realize like, uh they just feel like they've been abused and stuff, and they blow the whistle.
Yeah.
So yeah, you definitely have to be skeptical with gurus for sure.
Yeah. So back to your I was interested in, sorry, is it cutting out? It's making some weird noises.
No, I can hear you.
All right. Back to your Korea thing is so like how long does the like initiation and like process take? How long does it take to like learn this stuff? And also once you're practicing in a Korea school, from what I've heard, doesn't it, I mean, they understand there's some like really powerful practices and there's some like breathing techniques that are more powerful than others. Does it go through like some sort of stage process, or like you practice certain techniques for a certain amount of time, then you graduate to another stage and like do different techniques, or like how does that work?
That's true. Yeah. So to answer your first question, the initiation ceremony, it's first the actual initiation ceremony. You don't learn the techniques. It's kind of like this ceremony that involves a lot of symbolic components and a lot of mantras being chanted and stuff. And then after you've actually, that's the initiation. Then you learn the techniques and they teach them to you one by one. And so that's like a full day. That's like probably total, like, I think it was the initiation ceremony itself took like an hour. And then learning the techniques, all of them was like maybe 3 or 4 hours. And then the next day, I think at the end of that day and the next day, we like practiced together several times so that we made sure we understood the nuances of each technique and we were all doing them correctly.
Yeah.
And then we could like take notes too to help remember. And then, but then every once in a while, we'll have like, so I was initiated in November 17, I think. But they'll have the initiation events. The closest place they'll have them for me is up in Bellevue in the Seattle area. So
All
I'll
right.
sometimes go up there when they're having the initiation events and just like you can just uh, you can be there for the other people being initiated and then say this isn't the case for me, but if you've forgotten any of the techniques, you can just like get a refresher and you practice with the other people. So yeah, there's a support group and they make sure you're doing them correctly over time.
Yeah.
But there are different so what I practice is the first, what they call the first Kriya. And I think you're supposed to practice that for like a few years or until either until someone in the organization who's a teacher or like an acharya as we call them is the yogic name, like not a guru but someone the guru has designated to teach the technique is called an acharya.
Yeah.
So until they think you're ready, and I don't know how they see that or how they know that, um but yeah, and there are there are five or six different, like, because like then you'll get a different technique,
Yeah.
you'll learn a higher technique.
So that
And there's like five or six different higher techniques.
in a by technique, it's like not just one technique, it's like a series of different ways to breathe and how many sets to do and stuff like that.
Actually, from what I've heard, the first kriya is really like the it's the foundation.
Yeah.
So the first kriya contains a handful of different practices, and then the higher kriyas are like one more technique.
I see.
But you still, from what I've heard, I think from people who have received the higher techniques, you still practice all of those techniques in the first one, like for your whole life. If you maintain the practice your whole life, like you still always do the first stuff, but you like add on the higher one, or it might replace one component of the lower one, something like that. It doesn't totally replace the previous ones.
But through the initiation, you learn each extra stage or whatever you want to call it. You're learning a different technique.
Yeah.
Is there just like one main technique for the first initiation, what you're learning, or is it like you just practice the same thing every day? It's this technique. This is how you breathe. This is how you do the breathing technique, stuff like that. Pretty
So
much.
so it's a few techniques that are physical, like stretching, like what you might think of like as yoga poses
Yeah.
that are aimed at um, energizing. We call it energizing or magnetizing the spine, making the spine really twisting exercises that twist the spine and bend it to the left and right and and forward,
Yeah.
and balancing the hemispheres of the brain. And then um, you do all these exercises in the same sequence every time. There's a specific order you do them in and the reason behind that. And then you get to the culmination of it is sitting cross-legged, or if you can't, sitting in a chair, sitting with your spine erect and doing the breathing exercise, and then the silent meditation.
All right.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Um, how did you hear about Kriya Yoga?
So it was from Autobiography of a Yogi.
Oh yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I read that book when I was like 20, I want to say. And yeah, I was fascinated by it. Um, it wasn't for a few years after that that I actually sought out Kriya Yoga and wanted to practice it.
Yeah,
But yeah, that book had a huge impact on me.
it's awesome. I'll put it on the. I'll read it sometime. Put it on the to read list.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So this podcast has been going pretty long. Do you want to end it off with some book recommendations?
Um, like
Obviously,
what kind of book? I feel like you got to narrow me down a little more,
yeah, yeah,
because I don't want to say like, oh, read the Quran or whatever. I don't know.
let's say if you're been talking a lot about Kriya or about what's your favorite books about deepening yoga practice. Obviously you're not going to learn the Kriya technique anywhere because it's through the initiation like we said, but like to help
I
you.
want to mention, so the tradition that I follow.
Yeah.
You can learn more about them if you want. Kriya, it's called Kriya Yoga International. Let me just verify that really quick.
Okay.
Or the website. Yeah, so www.kriya.org is the
Okay.
website.
Kriya.
Kriya.org.
Kriya.org. Let's see. Definitely look into that.
Yeah.
Um Sweet. So you can find, looks like somewhere, there it is. Find a center near you. Sweet.
Yeah, so a book about deepening yoga practice.
Yeah.
So man, you might see, are you on their website?
Yeah, I am.
So the guy you'll see on their homepage on the left, that's Hari Harananda, who brought the lineage to the US. And then the guy on the right is the current teacher, Pragyanananda, who is his direct student. So
Gotcha.
both of them have written a ton of books. Hari Harananda, before he passed, he told Pragyanananda, the guy on the right, to I believe he told him to try and write one book every year, and I'm pretty sure he's succeeded in that. Pragyanananda has a ton of books, and let's see, I have some here. Um, yeah, so I have a few of them here. So these ones are by Pragyanananda. That's called The Universe Within, and it's about the chakras specifically.
All right.
And then this one
Universe.
is also by him. It's called The Law of Karma, and it's about karma. And then this one, this is probably my favorite book about actually the practice of Kriya Yoga. It goes into like in depth on. It actually does talk about the techniques a little bit, but you by reading the book you won't understand how to practice it. But it does. If you are initiated, this book will make sense to you because you'll know that what he's talking about.
Yeah.
This is by Hariharananda, Pragyanananda's master, and it's called Kriya Yoga: The Scientific Process of Soul Culture and the Essence of All Religions. And it's really cool, like if you're someone that already practices Kriya, because it goes into depth, like the the what the techniques are doing for you, like what is behind them, and like really the science. Like yoga is scientific, not in our Western sense, because you can't, some of the things in yogic science you can't really prove. Um, they're proved by direct
Yeah.
experience, I'd say. You
Yeah,
verify them
exactly.
yourselves. But Kriya Yoga is a very scientific process. So I would say one more thing about the purpose of it is, so we believe this is a very ancient understanding in science from India, is the science of the chakras and what they call the nadis, which are the subtle channels of through which the life energy flows in our body. And it's believed to be like what they call these are in the subtle body. It's not part of the physical body. They believe there's three bodies actually. And so beyond within our physical body, there's like what they call the energy body or the astral body.
Yeah.
And this has a specific anatomy. And so one of the purposes of Kriya Yoga is that of these many, actually, they say 72,000 energy channels that are in the subtle body, there's three main ones, and they run like this parallel from the top of the head within the spine to the base of the spine. And depending on, like, have you ever noticed how one of your nostrils gets clogged?
Yeah.
You can only breathe through one, and then another time it's the other.
Mm-hmm.
So they say that that's an indication of like where your energy is flowing through one of these channels and not the other.
All right.
So, and they also say that these channels have like the left channel is of the that opens through the left nostril is like the lunar energy. It's like it's more feminine, and it's a channel of like calmness, but also, or I would say calmness, but also it can be like lethargy. So you can do this experiment on yourself, see if it has any validity. Maybe sometime when you feel really like lazy and you've slept for like 15 hours or something, you've just been like had a super lazy weekend, like you've eaten a bunch of food and you haven't moved very much. Notice if your right nostril is clogged and you're breathing through just your left one.
All right.
And the opposite is true. Like your right nostril is so the right channel is like if you're really angry or like you're really fired up, that's that channel. And then there's a central channel which most people isn't open for most people. but the goal of Kriya Yoga is to balance these channels, and when the left and right become balanced, the central one becomes available. And then when your central channel, when your prana or your life energy is moving in your central channel, which is called the sushumna, it's you're automatically in meditation. It's really easy to meditate. So that's the purpose of these techniques. Is that the idea behind it is like if you do these techniques and you can open your sushumna nadi, then meditation is just like comes spontaneously.
So that's awesome.
So yeah, maybe I say
Yeah.
this is my favorite book on
So
Kriya
Kriya,
Yoga.
yeah.
If you already practice, I'm sure you probably enjoy it if you didn't know the techniques as well. But
I'll definitely give it a read. And also for the people listening, I'll put all these books in the show notes in the description and everything. If you want to find the links to them, into the website, into anything referenced, I'll put them I'll put them on my website in the show notes, which will be linked in wherever you're watching it, the description of the episode. One last thing I wanted to mention, last point I wanted to add on, you can always add on after too, is have you heard of the guy Ken Wilber?
yeah.
So I think his idea is really powerful in explaining, because I have a feeling that people, when they hear what you're talking about, might have quite a bit of skepticism. I mean, there's no reason you should just believe it off the first person you hear, right? There's a lot of people that'll probably have skepticism because of their current viewpoint, right? And
You mean about what I was saying about Kriya Yoga?
Korea, yeah,
Okay, yeah,
because like it's kind of, for a lot of people, I have a feeling it might not fit into their current worldview of like,
yeah,
they might be skeptical of the initiation and the practices and stuff like that. Is this
for sure, yeah.
idea that Ken Wilber puts forth, he calls it AQAL. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Mm-mm, I
And
haven't.
it's basically, it stands for all quadrants, all levels. It basically says there's different forms of truth that we can understand. And most people in the West, they only focus on one quadrant, which is the external objective, I believe. So basically, the quadrants are, I'll link it in the show notes or whatever. I'll send it to you later. But
Okay,
basically, it's like one side is subjective, one's objective, one's or that's the same thing. Yeah, subjective, objective, internal, external. So basically, like, science focuses only on the objective external,
mm-hmm.
and then like if you focus on like certain forms of psychology and like understanding psychological evolution, those are like
Mm.
subject, or those are like, or no,
Objective
no, that's what it
internal.
was. It was a personal, collective, subjective, or like internal, external, personal, or like as a group. So like you can
Yeah,
understand when you're talking to someone, you can understand their uh like, I'm trying to think real quick, but I don't. It's kind of hard to understand without actually seeing an image of the model. But basically, the idea is that there's different forms of truth. You can have this truth of like yogic truth, where you go within and you understand these deep truths within, while also at the same time having these scientific truths. It's like none of them is more true than the other, right? It's
yeah,
just they're different types of truth, right? There's no one right answer. Like science, there's no reason to try to think that science is completely wrong just because you're practicing Kriya Yoga, right? It's
yeah.
just like
I agree. Yeah,
you just understand that uh there's different there's different types of knowledge, and that there's no reason to think that there's only one type of knowledge, and that only the rational mind has all the answers, or the only the uh tran transrational or like beyond the mind, that thinking
Hmm.
only that has all the answers. It's like I think it's important to see all of this from the perspective of there's different types of knowledge, I guess. I don't know if you want to
Hmm.
add anything on that.
Yeah, I would say I would agree with that. Yeah, I think there's different. Um, there's things that science or deductive reasoning based on our five senses cannot uh, rationalize and can't explain. But I'm of the belief that there is more to our experience than what we can pick up with these five senses, which are just that they're sensors of data, different ways of uh, receiving data.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think I think if you look for, I'm not gonna try and convince any one of my beliefs on here, but I think
Yeah.
from my experience, like I I am a very skeptical person, and I consider myself a pretty rationally guided person. Um, and for me, the reason I believe some of the things I do that can't be necessarily proven is because um, experiences I've had that can't be explained. And also, one thing comes to mind. I went to this talk by a Tibetan Buddhist Lama teacher guy, like like a year or two ago, and the
Yeah.
whole talk was on death, dying, and reincarnation from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective. And he talked about the teachings or the research of this guy who was, I completely forget his name, but if you did some googling around some terms, I'm sure you could find him. But he basically researched thousands of cases of children. He was a child psychologist by profession, and he noticed in his practice that there was kids that would talk about past lives. And so he went full on into this research and collected thousands of cases of these kids that talk about their past lives. And in many cases, um, corroborated these stories. You know, these kids would say, I was so and so, and I lived here. This was my wife. And uh, he would go and do research and find out that this person did exist, and they were married to this person, and they did die in the same way. And just, yeah, you can't explain that because these children were like, you know, 4 to 8 years old or something,
Yeah.
and there's no way of explaining that in a rational way. So it's things like that um, that again, you could explain that away as a coincidence, but or I don't from my perspective, I don't think you can. Um, things like that, and the fact that he had so many corroborated instances with these kids.
Yeah. The fact that it
Um,
was thousands and not just one.
yeah, and also stories of stories of people's near death experiences. And people could say like, oh well, those kids are just making stuff up, and those people that have these NDE experiences, they're just making this up, it's just a hallucination, or they're just lying to get attention. And yeah, I can't prove that that's not true, but I personally believe that uh that those people are telling the truth. I don't see why someone would just make that up.
Yeah.
And then maybe you can see, maybe some people could say, oh well, I understand how people could make that up because they want attention and stuff, but it satisfies my rationality.
Well, especially with near death experience, it's like so many people are telling very similar experiences. And
Yeah.
like the big thing about flow, which we mentioned earlier, is like they're putting themselves almost into these near-death experiences on purpose because they know it'll produce a similar
Yeah.
mystical type experience. So
Yeah.
definitely. So yeah, that's a wrap.
Man, that was great. I didn't
That was awesome.
I looked at the clock when we were 2 hours in and I was like, man, it's been 2 hours. It kind of flew by.
Yeah, no,
Almost three and a
that was
half.
insane. Yeah. Uh, here, let me stop the recording.